Hello, everybody. My name is Dave Jackson, and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. This is a video games deep dive review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. My guest today is a friend of the show, a returning guest, one host of Lightning Strikes Thrice, and an Immortal podcaster. Welcome back, Ryan Batie.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's really great to be back here talking JRPGs with you again. I guess Tunic was not a JRPG, but, you know, it has vibes.
Right. We have previously done another JRPG. We did Final Fantasy X. That was episode 99 of the podcast. Tunic, like you said, was episode 63. And then we also did one of the episodes that I most frequently get feedback about, which was the discussion about whether video games need to be fun. And that was with Brad Galloway from So Video Games, GameCritics.com. And that episode was in May of 2023. It doesn't have an episode number if anyone wants to go back in time and check that one out. Today, we're going to be talking about Lost Odyssey. So back on the JRPG train. It is an RPG developed by Mistwalker and feelplus and published by Microsoft Game Studios for the Xbox 360 in 2008. If this is your first time listening to the show, first of all, thank you for stopping by. Here is how spoilers work today. This is the same policy we do on every episode. There will be a no spoiler section for a while where we'll talk about basically as much as we can without spoiling the story. And then we will warn people when spoilers are beginning, so you can jump out if you don't want to be spoiled about Lost Odyssey. Afterwards, we'll talk about all the spoiler stuff that we want to talk about. So, what is Lost Odyssey? I kept my elevator pitch simple here. This is the sad adults JRPG in a series or in a type of game that is generally full of optimism and stuff like that. This one's a bit more bleak and dark from time to time. What would you say?
Yeah, that you just nailed it in one. Because mine is basically a wordier version of that. My elevator pitch is: would you like to play a deeply sad meditation on aging and relevance made by a guy who himself was feeling ambivalent about his own place in the game creator landscape, that happens to be disguised as a quote-unquote love letter to the 32-bit era of JRPGs?
The answer to that question is yes, I would like to play that game. I played this on an Xbox 360. It is famously not available on PC. It has not been re-released on other systems. It's only available on the 360 or backwards compatible on the later Xbox systems. Shout out to Xbox for actually caring about backwards compatibility. But I actually went to my local game store. I bought a used Xbox 360 and Lost Odyssey in order to play this because I don't have a Series X or something like that. It took me 51 hours to get through it. Part of that is I was following a guide. Part of it is I didn't do a ton of side content once that stuff opens up. It can be a much longer game if you want it to be. So, Ryan, where did you play this? How long did it take you?
So I played this on the Xbox One through backwards compatibility. It's not on their digital store, but when I was one of the last times I was downsizing, I decided that I wanted to keep a few of my disc 360 games, even though I was selling my 360. And this is one of the ones that I saved. You put the disc in, it installs all 4 discs at once, even just off the main disc. And my game clock was closer to 65 hours. Because I did most of the side content. There was one thing that I did not fully do, and it was because it was too obnoxious. But yeah, this is if you're mainlining this game, it will probably be about 50. You can get it up to about 70 if you want to explore literally everything the game has to offer. Thankfully, yeah, there's the guides for this are robust, and you can search for like different side quests if you're stuck on just one thing. And so that part is nice. The people who have like written about this game have really done a good job of writing about it in detail. So yeah. Xbox One through backwards compatibility, about 65 hours.
Nice. And I think that this game is still available. Like, if you don't want to go buy the disc, I think you can buy it on the digital store on like the new Xbox Series consoles, but maybe not the Xbox One store. I see Wario64 post about sales for this game all the time. So
okay.
I think that it is available that way. The physical Xbox 360 version cost me like $25-$30 or something like that. Luckily, Xbox 360 is not crazy expensive like some older systems are. Not yet, I guess. So there we go. So how did we first get into Lost Odyssey? This is neither of our first time playing this game. So Ryan, we'll start with you first, as we always do. How did you first hear about this game? What made you want to play it? When did you first play it?
So yeah, I have loved Final Fantasy games basically since I've loved video games. It was my second big video game love after Mega Man. And after Sakaguchi kind of left Square in disgrace, that was kind of when I was like an upper class person in high school. And then I went to college and I didn't really have time for video games, but I like kept some of those video games on the back burner. And when I found out that Sakaguchi was doing 2 high-profile JRPGs for the Xbox 360 to try to bring sales in Japan for the 360 up, I was like, oh, I don't really care about Blue Dragon, but Lost Odyssey is exactly my shit. And so I like kept it on the back burner. And then kind of when I got back from college, I bought a used 360 at that point. And honestly, the first time I played it, because I think mentally I had hyped it up for like 3 years or maybe like 2 years or something. I thought it was kind of bad. Like, it was a very just like meh 6 out of 10 experience for me. It felt kind of like a cheap knockoff of all of these Final Fantasies that I loved. And I didn't really go back and try to replay it all the way through until a few years later. And then I ended up being way warmer on it. So it was a pretty big whiff my first time.
Yeah, I played this in 2012 or so not right when it came out, but I was an Xbox person with the original Xbox, and then the 360. I didn't have a PlayStation until a PS4. So Xbox 360 was my console, and I also loved some Final Fantasy games up before that, most notably 6 and 10, but I didn't have... Well, that's a lie. I played 13 when it came out on the 360, but... That's a whole other can of worms with that game there. Yeah. But I don't know exactly why I got into this. I know that an employee at GameStop recommended it to me, which is like, there's an oddly high number of my favorite games that started with like, hey, I'm looking for an RPG. Hey, have you try Morrowind, try Dark Souls, try Lost Odyssey. All 3 of those, just some dude at GameStop recommending. So hell yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, to those 3 people. Good job. So I got this, but I don't think it was like, oh yeah, also the people who made Final Fantasy did that. I don't know if I knew that back then. But I played it a ton. That first playthrough was more of that like 70, 80 hour playthrough where I did everything I could. And I loved it back then. It was like completely blew me away. And then it's just never really been available since then on modern systems. And I think even recently Sakaguchi said he's not interested in like making it more available. Who knows? Hopefully people buy Fantasian and he's, regains the taste for money or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, even though, and we might be jumping around a little, but even though his mobile RPGs aren't really my thing, it made him financially successful again.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why he didn't want to go back to console is he was like, well, Terra Battle did really well for me, and I don't have to feel like the disgraced, guy who got an entire studio in Hawaii completely shut down through my hubris. So I'm just going to stay in the mobile space now. Yeah.
Well, here's hoping. People in the future, hopefully you're listening to this and you're saying, you know what, Dave and Ryan, he did go back. So that was my history with it. I loved it when I first played it. And then for over 10 years, I just kind of was like, hey, it would be nice to play that game again someday. Maybe they'll put it on the Switch or on PC. And then I was like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to buy a 360 again and I'll play it. And now I'm starting to buy more games for the 360 that are kind of stuck there. So next month, and a little tease for another one of those coming up, we have Deadly Premonition coming up, where I bought that for 360 because the PC version doesn't work.
Oof.
So
that is a game that I'm really, really interested to hear the episode on, because
it's gonna be a fun one for sure.
Yeah, and like because that game like dominated so much discourse for so many years, and people have kind of finally stopped talking about it at every opportunity they could take, and so I feel like now is the time when someone could be the most fresh coming into that game. Yeah,
it's gonna be fun. As we're talking, I'm recording about that in like 2 weeks, so that's going to be a good time coming up in October. So I'm using that 360 for more than just Lost Odyssey. And
yes,
to get into our opening thoughts here, I didn't love Lost Odyssey as much this time around. I just think that like I'm paying closer attention. Like I have the microscope on it more now than I did back in 2012 when I was playing it. And I really enjoyed the story back then. And now replaying it, there are parts of the story that I really enjoy, but not the whole thing. So it might be a little difference in how much I explored every nook and cranny this time around, or maybe just like thinking about the approach to storytelling. There are some weird decisions in here that I don't think are very good, but I think that, you know, we talked about in the pitch, like the sad adults JRPG. I think that a lot of those themes that would attract someone who wants like a much more mature, a much sadder, more like contemplative tone in a game like this, I think a lot of that stuff still does really work really well. So I still think this game is pretty good. There is just some stuff that I don't think is great as far as storytelling. And I think the pacing really got to me sometimes, more so this second time around. But I'm glad I revisited the game this time.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah. It falls in a really weird space for me where, you know, JRPGs were, you know, one of my big first loves and one of the reasons why I got so into video games. And you know, I still do an incredibly deep dive podcast on JRPGs, and so that it's still part of my life. But in the intervening years between now and when I first loved the game, I've gotten tired of a lot of bits of tedium that are baked into the genre. And the interesting part about this game is that it has a lot of that tedium, but because it is positioned in this way as like an old guy making the kind of JRPG that made him famous and is a love letter specifically to 32-bit JRPGs, the genre has moved on. And a lot of the things that Lost Odyssey prioritizes are things that the modern genre does not prioritize. And so I saw the, you know, I was also bothered by the pacing bits. I also think that there is too much like interconnective tissue tedium. And I also think the story, the bones of the story are incredible, but the way the story is told sometimes falls flat. But I think because I came in nervous that I was going to be very against it, I ended up being really pleasantly surprised. And so my ultimate thoughts on this game are like a very warm 8 out of 10, provided that you have the patience for the things that it requires patience for. It scratches an itch that a lot of modern JRPGs do not scratch. And it's interesting that it was purposefully backward looking at the time that it was released and is even more backward looking now. But I think that actually, like, it works in its favor almost as often even as it works against it.
Yeah, I think that this episode, at least from my perspective, and it sounds like from your perspective too, it's going to be one of those games where we're like, this game is good, so this is not going to be like a trashing of the game or something like that. But because it's good, the parts that are not good stand out more in something like this, where you're like, these elements are good, and this, like, we have a sequence of 4 or 5 plot events, and like 3 of them are really awesome. And then the ones that aren't stand out more because they're next to the things that are really good.
Yeah.
And I think that that's going to be where some of like the glaring things come in. But we have a long podcast ahead of us to dig into those things. So let's listen to a bit of music, something that I think a lot of people do like about this game. And we'll come back and we'll set up the story. Lost Odyssey was written by the, again, Final Fantasy series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi after he left Square and formed his own studio. So the game begins with a quote that kind of like sets the tone for some stuff that's just going to be really important throughout this game. The quote reads, "When people die, they just go away. If there's any place a soul would go, it's in your memories. The people you remember, they're with you forever." And that quote sets up, I think, multiple things that this game really wants to focus on. This game deals heavily in loss. It deals heavily with memory because of some stuff that our main characters are going through. So interesting quote. And then the game throws you into a battle at the beginning. You have heavy infantry clashing with more heavy infantry, and like heavy. They're like, the heaviest armor knights fighting out on the battlefield. There's weird robots out in the battlefield smashing and slicing people up. There are battle towers with mages on there that are healing and reincarnating dead soldiers to go fight again. It is a wild opening scene. And one of the things that I think is really impressive about this game's presentation is a lot of these like set piece cutscenes are really, really impressive. And there's some really good ones later on in the game, but I think one of the best one is this opening cutscene in this battle.
Yeah, I agree. And it's for folks who were not around at the time, Squaresoft and then Square Enix were unparalleled at pre-rendered cinematic cutscenes. No one else really came close, at least in the space that they were working in. I think you could make an argument that like Blizzard's plot cutscenes for Diablo and StarCraft are like up there as well. But basically in the JRPG space, it was just Square. And even something like Legend of Dragoon, which was trying to ape Square, like it was off. Sakaguchi himself was not responsible directly for those movies, but he was the one who established the studio in Honolulu that worked exclusively to make these cutscenes so good. And then his downfall was that he was like, well, we basically have a movie studio already. Let's just make Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. And then Final Fantasy The Spirits Within like totally tanked and destroyed the studio. So anyway, I bring all that up because one of the big things about Lost Odyssey is that Microsoft gave this studio or this pair of studios a ton of money because they really wanted to penetrate the Japanese market. And these cutscenes are as expensive looking as Final Fantasy like 10 and 8 cutscenes. Like they are really, really well animated, and like they really play on spectacle. And it's awesome.
Yeah, speaking of that spectacle, so continuing on with that cutscene, we're introduced to our protagonist, Kaim Argonar, who enters the fray, kills a bunch of soldiers. You have a tutorial boss fight against this weird hammer arm machine. Utility in battle don't ask any questions why you would make this machine. It's just there to basically just drop and crush a very thin line of people. But it's a cool looking cutscene. It's a cool boss fight. You beat that thing, and then suddenly the spectacle kicks off because the sky above the battlefield opens up and like meteors start falling from the sky, killing everybody on the battlefield except for Kaim.
Yeah. This battle is so, it's just like, it's so, you know, there are a lot of games that will throw an introductory battle at you to teach the basic mechanics, and this is like barely even that, because most of the mechanics that make the battle system interesting aren't available here at all. But what it does do is show off the power of the Xbox 360 in real time, because while you're fighting, you see all these like hordes of animated soldiers all around you fighting and dying as well. So it does not feel like it is all of a sudden separated from the battle. Kaim is in the fray, in the middle of it. You beat the guy, and then all hell breaks loose. It's a very powerful opening.
Yeah, it's really good. And so like that's where the the big spectacle ends, when this meteor comes and the whole battlefield is washed with fire and magma and all that stuff. But Kaim gets up from it, and everyone is like, hey, we didn't think anyone survived. And we're surprised too, but we learn the reason for that is because Kaim is immortal. He is one of a handful of immortal characters in the game. Kaim doesn't remember anything about his past. He starts out, it's the amnesiac protagonist here. There's a reason for it in this game, which we'll get to later. But that's one of this game's big themes that it touches on as well. We talked about things like loss and memory and stuff. We have them all in Kaim here because I think this game's biggest theme that it touches on the most is what it's like to be immortal and, live many lives and see everybody that you love die throughout the course of all of your lives. And then Kaim gets his memory wiped at some point. So it's like, you go through the process of recovering memories, but every time you recover memories in this game, it's always something really sad. Yeah. And like some of them are quite brutal that you remember. So like this is the kind of subject area that this game wants to play in and spends most of its time in.
And it's an interesting contrast because so the big, like, the quick and dirty, I guess, elevator pitch for Sakaguchi as a storyteller is that he did not care about story at first, and then when they were developing Final Fantasy III, his mom died, and he was really rocked by that experience. And so then death became this obsession of his from, 4 and 7 especially. And then, he kind of got more into an advisory role after that. But this is a lot of his pet themes, but instead of focusing on the deaths themselves, they focus on the people who are still living.
Yeah.
And I think that is a much more mature approach, and also I think might be informed by, okay, I'm an old guy. I've lived forever in industry terms, and I've seen a lot of loss both in my personal life and in the industry, and I'm just trying to reckon with that and reckon with, how it has shaped me as a person. I could be wrong, this is speculation, but I feel a lot of Sakaguchi working out some shit in this game.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that with what the immortal characters have to reckon with, and we'll touch on that in just a second. I want to introduce a couple other main characters here. We have another immortal character that Kaim meets really quickly named Seth. And Seth is another immortal. She is a soldier, kind of like Kaim. She also doesn't remember, much about her past. So we have these two immortals, and then we meet our third character really early in the game, and there's more that we meet later. But the main three for a little while are Kaim, Seth, and then Jansen, who is a mage. Jansen is tasked by one of the local, we'll say, generals to go along with Kaim and Seth on a mission to check out this this giant magic engine that's being constructed. And Jansen's not immortal. Jansen's just a regular guy, and that's like part of Jansen's character too. Jansen's very weird for a JRPG character. I don't think I've ever seen a character quite like him. He's always wisecracking. He is always talking. He's one of those people that like just mouth is running no matter the situation. Jansen works through situations by talking to himself, to other people. So he's always talking. And so we have these two immortals that are very stoic, we'll say, especially Kaim. And then you have Jansen, who's the exact opposite of that. And the way that they work with the immortal characters, basically showing you throughout all of the things that you learn why the immortal characters would be so stoic and so, possibly just sad about a bunch of stuff that they've lived through. And then you have the mortal character who, obviously doesn't have that same perspective. And it's interesting to put them together like that.
It is. I've got a couple notes on this. First is I want to just emphasize something that you wrote down, but we haven't said yet, which is like Kaim's stoicism is almost comedic to the point where he is the point where he's saying I don't know or I don't care to everything
early in the game. Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, he's basically like Cloud in reverse, where Cloud is like a bitter, dumb asshole who can't connect to people because he's a teenager, and Kaim is a bitter, stubborn asshole who can't connect to anyone because he's just seen too much shit, and he's lost contact with the piece of humanity that allows him to be warm. Which, I mean, he is the closest thing, like, speaking of JRPG for adults, there are no main characters between the ages of 16 and 19 in this game, which is like unheard of. Yeah. And early game Kaim is like the closest we get because he approaches it because he's an old guy. The other thing that I want to say that I think I wrote down later, but it's a good point to put it down here, Jansen, so this game, especially because it was being funded by Microsoft and all that, the voice acting track was originally done in English, and the mouth movements were animated to the English voice track, not the Japanese. And Jansen's, I'm going to have to stop myself from saying Jansen because I play this game half in Japanese and half in English just to kind of back to A/B test the different voices. And Jansen's voice actor was encouraged to ad-lib and improvise almost all of the time. And that's where you get his motor mouth persona, and the amount that he actually talks out loud in the Japanese version is like less than 30% of it. But the subtitles show the English dialogue, and so it has all the ad libs. But Jansen in particular would not work without the voice performance he has and that encouragement for improvisation, because it makes what could be a very stock character of like really annoying ladies' man who is really only out for himself at first, and then slowly grows to care for and love people. Like, that character could have been so annoying, and he is a little bit annoying, but on purpose in a very endearing way. And in general, every character who seems pretty one note at first gets at some deepening and expansion by the end of the game. Jansen went from one of my least favorite characters to one of my favorites, just by sheer force of his charisma and his personality, with him constantly talking.
Yeah. He was pretty annoying at first, and he remained, some degree of annoying the whole game for me, but I did end up liking Jansen as a character. And I think part of it is, as you said, there's growth to Jansen, and as you also said, there's growth to basically everybody. And I think Kaim is a really good example of starting out as that character who literally just could not care, like doesn't have the capacity to care about small little like day-to-day concerns anymore. He doesn't remember anything, but he knows that, you know, he's seen some shit. So like you said, a lot of his dialogue early in the game is either I don't know or I don't care. He does not elaborate on those statements either. That's all he has to say most of the time. But there is development and growth with Kaim when certain other characters get introduced later on in the story that I think is quite good.
I agree.
Yeah. So we have the kind of plot in like the way that the story is presented in an RPG like this. Like, you know, you have your characters, you walk through the world, you have your animated cutscenes, you have your nicer pre-rendered cutscenes. But this game introduces another type of story presentation, which is really interesting and very non-standard for this type of game, which are these written text sections called the 1,000 Years of Dreams. They're little short stories that you come across at key points in the story, or you might find them doing side content or exploring. Some of them are mandatory as you play through, but there's a lot that you will miss if you don't go poking around everywhere any chance you get, like the opportunity. These short stories were not written by the main writing team. They were written by Japanese author Kiyoshi Shigematsu, and they were translated for the English version of the game by Jay Rubin, who I knew the name Jay Rubin because Jay Rubin is Haruki Murakami's translator for his books, and I've read lots of Murakami's books. And these are, well, let's just say the quality of writing between the main game and these 1,000 Years of Dreams short stories is stark. It is a big step up in quality of writing. Now, in the defense of the people writing the rest of the game, they have different goals for the type of writing that they're doing here. For the rest of the game, they don't need to describe anything visually, for example, because you see it in the game, in the place that you are. But these are really descriptive. They are really heartfelt. Each story is going through one of Kaim's memories, or maybe one of Seth's, or another character that you might meet later. These are really just excellent. And I think that a lot of the emotional core of this game lives in these stories, which is really interesting to me.
Absolutely. I totally agree. They are really lyrical, and their presentation. There was a pre-order bonus in Japan where you could get these compiled in a book. I don't think it was ever officially localized and brought over here, but I was thinking about it as I was, because we were talking about favorite passages to share in the spoiler, after the spoiler wall. And, just as text, they don't hit quite as hard. They're still very beautiful, but the way that the game, it's like, certain words are animated where there will be like a word like that, like falls down onto the screen a few times. And there are occasional sound effects on top of whatever the background music is. And it really just like, even though you're just reading these short stories, some of which can take like 10 to 15 minutes to read, honestly. So it's like, it's hefty and can feel a little bit like an interruption if it happens like right as you're like trying to play the game. Just the overall package, the way that they're written and translated, the way that they are presented on screen is very powerful and really just like drips with humanity and grief. And I was skeptical of having so much story delivery being done in this odd method at first, but I was totally won over after I read just a couple of them because they're beautiful. Jay Rubin, I saw Jay Rubin give a talk about translation of Murakami's works a few years ago, and it's like the talk that got me interested in localization in the first place because of the ways that he talked about having conversations with an author and like really trying to get to the like emotional and artistic essence of what a particular author is trying to get at, and trying to then shape that poetry and that symbolism into something that can be understood in the English language or whatever language you're translating into. His work, both Shigematsu's work writing them and Rubin's work translating them, I cannot speak highly enough of. They're so good.
Yeah, it's excellent, and very similar to, so if anyone out there has not played Lost Odyssey but has played Nier, the original, or Replicant, it's the same as the sections giving Kaine's backstory in that game. Background music, you know, a little bit of like very light, but a little bit of visual flair as you're reading it. It's funny, those little animations, like a word like falling down or a word like fading in or spiraling or something like that. It's like, you know, the things that I learned how to do in PowerPoint when I was in high school to spruce up my presentation or something like that. But the content in them is really, really good. And so I think that like when you play Lost Odyssey, if you're interested in like the pitch of what the story is exploring, those themes of immortality and loss and life and death and things like that, I think you might be surprised to see like most of that theming is located in here and not in the main game. And it's one of the like things, it's one of like the criticisms about the writing of the main story that I have, is that the main story is more focused on a political plot. And I don't think the main story, where our main characters, the immortals and the mortals, could talk to each other about these exact things, I don't think the main story does enough of that. But the message is given across in these 1,000 Years of Dreams short stories, where I think a lot of them are there to give you Kaim's immortal perspective. Most of them are about Kaim on his travels throughout these 1,000 years, with just random people that he meets out in the world in a random ass town. You know, they have their problems. Kaim has a much bigger perspective on everything because he's probably seen this situation dozens of times. So most of them are there either to give you Kaim's, you know, immortal perspective on these things, or to just let you soak in the tragedy that Kaim sees over and over and over again through his long life, or both. So these were like appointment reading. Basically, it was like, because you can get these and you can choose, like, do I want to read this now, or do I want to read it next time I save, or next time I sleep, I think is the thing. But I always read them right there on the spot. This was my favorite part about the story in this game, was reading these. The only problem is, sometimes you'll get like 4 of them in a row, like in the same town, you'll unlock like 4 of these, which I don't think is great. I think they should be spaced out a little bit more, but they are so good that I did want to read every single one that I came across when I found them.
Yeah. I tried once because I was just in a groove to like, I came across 3 in a row and I just wanted to keep playing that night. I didn't want to switch to like a different gameplay mode of like reading and ruminating. And so I waited till I stayed at an inn. And what I noticed was, number one, when you read them back to back to back to back, you kind of forget some of the details. And then the second is that where you find them in the story will often add a little bit of resonance, because what happens is you like stumble across a conversation, and then that conversation makes, like, it says, you know, something triggered a memory in Kaim, and then it will be commenting not directly on what just happened, but it's like, oh, that reminds me of a different time that I was very sad. And so that context, that context of where I ran into them ended up mattering more. So I stopped doing that.
Yeah.
I want to say there was one, early story, one early dream that kind of lays out the thesis for the 1,000 Years of Dreams in total. And if it's okay, I'd like to quote it.
Yeah, sure.
So I don't remember exactly which, this might be from the Flowers one. Anyway, it just says, Kaim continued his long journey. A dizzying number of years and months flowed by, years and months during which numberless wars and natural calamities scourged the earth. People were born and they died. They loved each other and were parted from the ones they loved. There were joys beyond measure and sorrows just as measureless. People fought and argued without end, but they also loved and forgave each other endlessly. Thus was history built up as the tears of the past evolved gradually into prayers for the future.
It's good stuff.
Mm.
And that's representative of all of these stories, basically. The conversations that are in those stories, and then they always kind of end with that kind of a perspective, I guess, that Keim has, or, you know, just something to leave you with as the story is ending and you move on to the next thing you're doing in the main game.
Mm-hmm.
So these are great, and I think they are mandatory reading, basically. Like, I can't imagine playing this game and missing the content that these give you, the subject matter that these give you. These are, awesome.
I completely agree.
Now, Lost Odyssey, we talked about at the beginning, is quite a long game. This genre has a reputation for being very long, but I think that the average game is shorter than Lost Odyssey in the genre, especially the average Final Fantasy game. And so I talked about in the beginning how the pacing kind of drags, and I play a lot of long games, and I don't always feel the length of them the way that I felt how long Lost Odyssey is. And it was only 51 hours for me, but it was a long 51 hours.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of dig into a few reasons why I think this game feels as long as it does. The first reason why is the first disc is full of plot events that propel you forward. You meet new characters. You have a motivation to go to a new place. There are a lot of really memorable scenes that happen in the first disc, we'll say, and into the second disc a little bit too. And then you have a very long stretch where it's not to say that nothing happens, because you have character interactions and you have very slow development of characters, but there is not a big plot moment that happens really until like disc 3. Like, you might go an entire disc in this game without having one of those big things that makes you excited to move forward in the story again, where like this game kind of feels like it's stuck in the mud from time to time. And I think part of that is the combat takes a long time, which we'll talk about, and then that gets compounded by the fact that the dungeons that you go through take a very long time in this game. They're all long dungeons. And in those dungeons, I don't think there's enough storytelling to make you kind of excited to push on in that dungeon, basically. Like, you'll have a conversation at the beginning of the dungeon. You might have a very short thing in the middle, and then you'll fight a boss, and maybe the boss is plot relevant, and you might meet a new character or something like that at the end of the dungeon. But there's like almost no storytelling that happens in those, sometimes 2 hours.
Yeah.
While you're doing that, it is just all combat, maybe some light puzzling, as dungeons go and stuff like that. So if you get like 2 or 3 of those in a row, suddenly you're looking at a long stretch of game where there were points where I forgot what was really going on in the story because there was so long in between, we'll say, like, very important things happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it is super interesting in that I feel like a lot of video games, and honestly just like a lot of fantasy stories, have a very doughy middle section where essentially it's the gang goes on a journey and it's a travelogue as they go from place to place. Mm-hmm. And there are some interesting things that happen in the populated places, but I think one of Lost Odyssey's big flaws is that most of the dungeons, the reason you're going through them is that you have to go through them to get to the next place. It's like, you know, there are certain exceptions where you're going there for a story reason, but for the most part, it's like, oh, this mountain pass is blocked, and so I have to go through the ice cave, or, oh, I, you know, can't get into town, so I have to go through an enemy-infested back way to get to town. So it's entirely just like these dungeons, which by and large I personally like, which we can talk about in a little bit, but like I agree with you that story takes such a back seat during these dungeons, and so the gang goes on a journey section of this game feels very story sparse, and a lot of the dungeons are neat mechanically, but number one, they're too long, and number two, they do not do a lot to justify themselves other than this is an obstacle that's been put in front of the party, and that's it.
Yeah, the other thing that I was working toward that you are touching on there is that I guess like we'll say three main things that will take up your time, which are doing dungeons, doing story content, and reading the 1,000 Years of Dreams are very modal and separated from each other. Mm-hmm. There are not often 1,000 Years of Dreams sequences in the middle of dungeons. There are not often long story things in the middle of dungeons. You are often like in dungeon mode, or I'm going to sit back and watch 15 minutes of cutscenes, or I'm going to find 1,000 Years of Dreams thing and read it when I'm walking around town during like the parts of this game where you're just kind of like let loose in a new town to go talk to everybody, maybe pick up a few side quests, visit the shops and stuff like that. And you'll pick up some 1,000 Years of Dreams during those sections as well. Sometimes, like I said, there's one town where there's like, you take 2 steps and you get another 1,000 Years of Dreams, and then repeat that 3 times. So I think that if it were mixed up a little bit more, like if I'm going through a dungeon that takes 2.5 hours to get through, I would like to have that broken up by some extended cutscenes or a couple of 1,000 Years of Dreams stories. But the fact that there is nothing to break that long stretch up makes it feel longer. And when it's just battle after battle after battle after battle while you're doing these puzzles and stuff like that.
I agree, and I think that speaks to just like the pacing issues overall in this game, because almost the entirety of Disc 3, like 2/3 of Disc 3, is the one place where all of a sudden the dungeons have a very explicit story motivation, and it becomes this very railroaded linear experience. And it's a lot of people's favorite part of the entire game. When people talk about Lost Odyssey fondly, a lot of them immediately go to, Disc 3, where the plot finally kicks in, and like all of the gameplay that I'm doing is directly tied to that plot. But like, there are almost no 1,000 Years of Dreams in there. There are almost no side quests or exploration in there, except for exploring these dungeons that you're in. And so it creates whiplash where, okay, things were going too slow for too long, and there was too much meandering, and all of a sudden there's no meandering, and it can be almost claustrophobic, just how propulsive it becomes.
Yeah, and then after that, so you have like that railroaded section of, if I'm remembering right, a couple of pretty long dungeons in a row. And like the story's picking up then, so you do have a little bit more like drive to get through those. And then Disc 4 is like, hey, did you notice we didn't have any side quests in this game? Disc 4 is like, okay, all of the side quests are now available, and you can go do the final dungeon whenever you're ready. But that's another odd pacing decision to, most games, I think, for the better, will break up the main story by letting you pick up odd, side quests in each town that you go to. And this game will give you like some really light things where it's like, someone lost something. Maybe you can go find it out, in the area directly outside of their town or something like that. Or there are these treasure hunts that you come across where you can find some treasure. But like the side quests are basically all only available in disc 4. Mm-hmm. So it's like disc 1 propels you forward with the new story, the new characters, everything is, got a lot of momentum. Disc 2's and most of disc 3 are very quiet for the most part. It's a lot of like quiet moments, which, there's a lot of good quiet moments, but that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Then disc 3 is like, okay, long, like you said, very linear dungeons you're going through. And then disc 4 is like side quest time, do what you want, then the game's over. So like when you lay out how it's all paced out, it is pretty odd.
It is. And Final Fantasies 7 and 8 also have the like, okay, final disc, time for the big side quest, but it is not nearly as extreme as it is in Lost Odyssey, where, you can approach the final dungeon. And by the time you approach the final dungeon, you might be approaching 50 hours. And so you're like, you know what? I want to be done with this game now. But there's another like 15 hours of stuff that you can do. Some of it sucks, but some of it is really good also. I was surprised at how much I was enjoying like some of the optional battles and stuff. And it's just kind of baffling how they just shunted all of it into disc 4. It's really, it's hinky. Yeah.
I think that, you can blow that up into just how the story is told in this game in general. It's pretty disjointed. It's uneven. The pacing is weird, but the content is often quite good. Mm-hmm. And, when we get to the spoiler section, because we've taken quite a bit of time talking about the story here, when we get to the spoiler section, we'll definitely talk about a lot of that good stuff. And then there are parts about the story, important things that I think are quite bad, or at least need discussion to dig into to see, where we land on them. But there is a lot of really good stuff in the story and in some of that side content too. Mm-hmm. So for now, we'll put a pin in the story. Let's listen to a bit of music and come back and talk about the presentation in Lost Odyssey. So we talked a little bit about the spectacle of those big cutscenes, and that's definitely on display here. We talked about the voice acting as well earlier. And the other things about the presentation that I wanted to note are, you and I are both, obviously, we did the Final Fantasy X podcast together. We're both big fans of Final Fantasy X. Mm-hmm. So I turned this game on and I was like, wow, this is Final Fantasy X on the Xbox 360 with how it's all presented. It has the same linear progression through, very narrow linear paths to walk on. When you get into battle, it has that same, camera showing off your characters getting ready for battle. In this game, people have little voice lines at the beginning and end of combat, instead of just the little animations they did in Final Fantasy X. You have the animated run-ups to go run up and hit enemies in combat. Now, I think that stuff contributes to this game feeling slow also, because your average standard, random battle, because of all of these animations and load in and all of that, takes longer than I think it should.
Absolutely.
But it does have that cinematic focus to the presentation the same way that Square has always been known for. When a new Final Fantasy dropped, especially when it was a new Final Fantasy on a new console, they were always like, okay, here's where we're setting the bar for presentation now. Mm-hmm. Can you keep up with us? Final Fantasy X felt like that too, to me. Lost Odyssey feels like they wanted to basically do what Final Fantasy X did, but with, you know, better graphics, basically.
Yeah, and I have another note about that, which is that because it was on the 360, Lost Odyssey also, because it was on the 360 and because it was kind of developed by two separate studios, one handling the story and one handling the gameplay, it was on Unreal Engine, and Unreal Engine is not as bright and colorful as a lot of other like PS2 era JRPGs are.
Yeah.
And they make that work a lot of the time. And there is still some like green and blue, like, you know, in especially one of like the big coastal city country, like city state that exists. But they managed to make the additional like brown and earth tone of the Unreal Engine 3 in particular, work with the more mature angle with very like industrialized, smoky, dark cities.
Yeah.
But I do think that one of the things that makes the dungeons feel so sloggy sometimes is that that's where all of the just like, they don't try to make the dungeons that visually interesting, and so it's where all of the crimes of Unreal Engine 3 being so brown pop in, because it's tough to care about a dungeon when it's just like another cave. Oh, this cave has a little green in it because it's poisonous, or like this cave is a little bit more purple because it's evil, but for the most part they're all just caves.
Yeah, the dungeons are not very visually interesting. There's some like architecture to some, like when you go in like some ruin type dungeons, but there are a lot of caves, and there are just a lot of like outdoor area dungeons too that are also not very visually interesting. Like I think a lot of the work that went toward visuals in here went toward those cutscenes, and also the character designs are pretty interesting as well. Kaim really bothers me with that one little wisp of strand of hair down, like running down the middle of his nose. Like, come on, man, like tie that shit back. You don't, I guess he's like, man, I've been alive for over 1,000 years. I don't care about this anymore. But like, I have long hair, and I'm like, come on, man.
Me too. We did not talk about this before the podcast, but I have 2 comments in my own notes written in all caps. I want to sweep that strand of hair out of Kaim's face so badly. Yeah. But they were like, look at what we can do. We can make this hair like, you know, blow in the wind and still stay perfectly in the center of his forehead. And I'm like, yeah, it would probably like itches his nose all of the time. Just get it out of there.
Get it out of there. Yeah. What are you doing? I mean, I know that you're 1,000 years old and you're above the petty concerns of the mortals, but come on, man. Like,
doesn't that just like itch a little?
Yeah, exactly. Like you probably still feel itches for sure. But yeah, the presentation, like for the Xbox 360, I do think that this game looks really good. And I can only imagine that if you're playing it on a more powerful Xbox, we'll say, like I know some people played this on Series X and they do like the upscaling with the backwards compatibility. I'm sure that this game looks really good. Yeah. If you have that going on the Xbox 360, on my shitty little like 1080p monitor TV that I played it on, it looked fine.
The up-resing on the Xbox One did a lot. And the only downside is that sometimes there were certain like lighting effects that didn't deal well with the anti-aliasing, and it would make like a flickering effect every now and then. But that's the only, otherwise, both the up-res and the like improved lighting does wonders. It is a really good looking game.
Nice. Music in Lost Odyssey is composed by a longtime collaborator with Sakaguchi, which is Nobuo Uematsu, who's one of my favorite video game composers, and returned to work with Sakaguchi again on this game. So this soundtrack is really interesting. It feels different to me, and probably because a lot of my familiarity with Uematsu's work is from the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation eras of Final Fantasy. So this is a soundtrack that incorporates, orchestras and electric guitars and stuff like that. Couple of shout outs that I wanted to give for some songs. First of all, the main theme of Lost Odyssey, I think, is just an excellent piece of music. It is moody as hell and really sets the tone. If you sit on the main menu and just listen to it, it's definitely sad, but it has a couple of, hopeful movements in it where it kind of lifts up. And as Uematsu does, that melody is reused in many, many different forms throughout the rest of the game. And another shout out to the map screen music. I forget what the actual track is called, but it just kind of gives you another version of that melody. But then like a couple minutes into it, it kicks into like electric guitars and stuff. And it's like just really fucking good. And it's the map screen where you usually spend about 10 seconds on that screen, just being like, go into the next one. So I hope that people just kind of sat on that map screen and could hear that, that transition, because that song rocks. But I think the soundtrack is not always the most like memorable or evocative, but during the moments I think when it's supposed to hit, it does.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's so tough to compare Uematsu's work here with his body of work with Final Fantasy, because with Final Fantasy, he has these iconic melodies that are new for these different games, and they're usually tied to characters, but then he's also working off of and adapting these melodies that have been around since the first couple of games. And so it's hard when it's all new, but yeah, it's like half the soundtrack for me is amazing, and half of it, when he's trying to ape his own past work too directly, it can get kind of phoned in. So like, for example, just the battle fanfare that happens at the very end of each battle is trying to be the victory fanfare from Final Fantasy, but because it can't use that exact melody, it just kind of sounds a little farty to me. But by and large, I agree with you. I think that there are a lot of really excellent tracks that hit when they really need to.
Yeah. The battle music is interesting too, because it's not the... It reminds me more of the Final Fantasy X battle music, where it's like, it's battle music for sure. It's kind of upbeat, but Lost Odyssey is probably the most reserved JRPG battle music that I think I've heard in a while. Especially compared with Final Fantasy 7 or 6 or 4 or something like that. Just thinking of Final Fantasies that I've played recently. So that was, it kind of fits too. Like, the Immortals are not going to be super jazzed up to go into battle to fight, little slimes or something in the dungeon, right? It's all, this is pretty ho-hum for them. And I think the music kind of fits that tone a little bit. On the other hand, I do want to give a shout out to the final boss track, which is, if you've ever just like listened to a composition and just imagined in your head, like the composer just fucking mashing a piano and lightning's crashing around them and stuff. That's what this final boss track is like. Like, it's not Dancing Mad. It might not be One Winged Angel, but it's like Uematsu's like, I'm going to let my love of progressive metal come in this final boss track here. Yeah. And it's got like the vocals, like the chorus going, ha, 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 and then it just goes into this wild, like progressive metal song, very like Dream Theater type stuff, for a touch point that I'm familiar with. But that is, I had forgotten about that song. And when the final boss fight started, I was like, holy shit, what is this?
Yeah. It like got me. It's so funny because the final dungeon of this game is where I finally started feeling some real fatigue. And then that anthem kicks in, or that boss theme kicks in. And it's like, all right, I'm sitting back up again. I'm interested again. It does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is like get your adrenaline up, get you sitting up. It's good.
Absolutely. Yeah. So people will hear a lot of that music throughout the podcast. We're going to take another music break now, come back and talk about what it's like to play Lost Odyssey. gameplay in Lost Odyssey is turn-based combat. It is not the Final Fantasy ATB. It is straight up turn-based with random encounters as you go through the dungeons. It will show you the turn order at the bottom of the screen, and you can do a little bit of light manipulation. Basically, if you can put a status effect on something or kill it before its turn, then you will, it won't be able to act sometimes. So it's not quite Final Fantasy X levels, even though I think this combat system is fairly inspired by Final Fantasy X's turn-based system. Pretty standard other than that, though, with what you can actually do in combat, fight, skills, and magic. I think the real juice to the combat here is in how you customize your characters before combat starts.
Yes.
But this is a classic turn-based system where you see the turn order at least, so you don't have to guess who's going to attack when.
Yeah. I did so much thinking about this combat system because I think it is in theory incredible, and a few times they actually live up to that, and then a lot of the encounters that they throw at you aren't worth how fiddly it can get. So okay, related to the turn order is magic. And so this is not a game where you can just have everyone attack all the time. You your attackers are attackers and your magic users are magic users. And different enemies have different strengths and weaknesses. And so you really do have to pay some attention.
Yeah.
The coolest part of the turn order stuff to me is how magic works. Basically, the more powerful a spell is, the longer it will take to cast, sometimes requiring a turn and a half or 2 turns of warm-up before it actually goes off. You can also, so an enemy can prepare a spell and you can see that, this is going to go off at the end of this turn. But if I attack this enemy enough, then it will actually delay it into the next turn. That can also happen to your guys. And so your characters can get delayed by a whole turn if they're casting a long spell and they get hit. What this does is, there are skills that allow you to speed up someone else's spell at a cost.
Yep.
And then also it means that healing items, which are always instant, they always happen as the first thing that happens in a turn, have some utility because it's oh crap, do I want to wait for this powerful heal spell to go off, or do I want to make sure that this person gets topped off very quickly? And so items are never obviated. And I think that's neat. Unfortunately, because of the fact that it is slightly more difficult than a bog standard JRPG, but not so difficult that it's requiring important decisions in every single battle, coupled with the animations that you talked about earlier, the fact that you have to do a little bit of thinking and that each battle is going to take a minimum of 90 seconds. Really, it's the encounter rate in this game is actually not that bad, but because the battles themselves take longer, it really starts to add up.
Yeah, they do give you a lot of at least interesting choices to make, where I think a lot of the time, for example, you mentioned the skill, it's called casting support, that allows a character to help another character cast their magic faster. A lot of times I was okay, Kaim's a very powerful physical attacker, but it's in my best interest to have Kaim help one of the mages get their attack off instead of having Kaim attack. So you are given those interesting choices. And you're right, it is in that weird middle ground where it's not Darkest Dungeon, but it's also not, mid-game in Final Fantasy VI, where every single battle is exactly the same. But it's that weird middle ground where I am making decisions, but it's basically the same order of operations for a lot of fights. The only new thing that might come up is there's a new enemy type and I have to figure out what it's weak to or something like that, which is interesting. I'd rather those choices be here than not be here. But it does contribute to battles taking a little bit longer with all those animations and stuff. And me feeling like I have to be involved in the battles, but I wasn't challenged by the battles.
Yeah.
So it is an odd middle ground to have. I would still rather have this, I think, with the unfortunate, length that the battles take. I would still rather have this than I get into a random battle, I mash A 100 times, and then the battle's over.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which you actually can do that in this because you can set your cursor to remember what you did on your last turn. So if you're doing the same skills each turn, you can just sit there and mash A through them in certain situations. But the other complication that it throws at you is a thing called the GC system. I think it's called guard condition is what that stands for, which is where your back row characters, because you have a front row and a back row, your back row characters are shielded from direct damage by your front row characters. And it is making that into a mechanical system. Whereas in other games, like it might just be like back row characters will take less damage, or they will not be able to be hit by melee attacks, but they'll be weak to ranged attacks or something like that. In this one, the HP of your front row characters acts as a temporary shield for the back row characters. So if your front row characters are at full health, the back row characters will take almost no damage. As the front row takes damage, that shield gets weaker and weaker. And you have skills to restore this. You have skills to swap your position. There are some boss fights that will like mix up your party formation to fuck with your guard condition. This is an interesting thing. I don't think I've ever seen this in another game like this. Front row, back row is very standard in the genre, but not making it into a whole mechanical system like this.
I think it really started to sing when I got skills that could restore guard condition, because then I actually it wasn't just like a time limit on which I had to like kill everybody before my back characters were vulnerable. And so when it is singing, I think that it adds a tremendous like dimension of strategy and decision making to both sides of the fight. Like, okay, how do I get the opponent's guard condition down enough that I can get at the back character who's actually like the really big damage dealer? Or how do I preserve my own guard condition? So yeah, when it works, it's one of my favorite things about this battle system. I don't think it always works.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, I'm glad you brought up that this works for the enemies too. The enemies always have this going on if there are multiple rows of enemies. I think that this system is half good and half bad, and it's a literal, like, dealing with the enemy's guard condition is a fun puzzle to figure out in combat. And we already talked about, like, how you'll get into a lot of fights with, like, the same groupings of enemies. So, like, you'll have an order of operations for, like, oh, this group, I need to take out these first, then I'll get to the ones in the back. Or, like, I can take out two of them, the guard condition will be halved, and then I'll be able to get, like, the back ones down maybe before completely depleting the front row or something like that. So, like, the strategizing around that is pretty fun with the opponents. For your characters, I don't think this system's very good because in random battles, it doesn't really matter because you'll probably take them out before it becomes a real consideration, until maybe later in the game when enemies are just more powerful. Where it should be a bigger factor is, like, boss fights feel like they should be built around this. And there are a couple that are, including it's like maybe the first or second boss that, like, tutorializes this, where it's basically like, if you don't understand the guard condition, this boss is going to wreck your shit. And you figure it out and you can beat the boss. But I found in most boss fights, my guard condition just got wrecked immediately, basically. So it wasn't really a consideration. And, like, the skills that you get that can restore it would restore, 1/8 of the max GC when it's at 0. So, like, what good is that actually doing? It's probably better just to heal and revive people than to try and rebuild the GC. Because the other part of it is once a character falls in combat, if they get revived, that GC doesn't come back. It stays at 0. So in those boss fights, I found my GC just went to shit immediately. So it was like, well, that's not part of my strategy anymore. I could spend 6 turns trying to rebuild it, but the boss is attacking the whole time.
That's interesting. I think I had a different experience. I think that it really did factor in, and I would one character gets an ability that then the Immortals can learn that significantly restores GC, and I ended up using that a lot just to like keep the numbers up.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But yeah, I see how it could go to shit so quickly that you're like, well, I'm just going to focus on healing and doing damage. But it was a bulwark for me against some of the scarier enemies to kind of use the GC increasing abilities.
Part of the reason that I think that you relied on this more than me is I think that I took advantage of the way that Immortals learn skills more than you did. Because, so for those who haven't played, mortal characters like Jansen learn skills as they level up, like Pokemon. Mm-hmm. Immortal characters can copy skills from mortal characters, and any immortal character can learn any skill from any immortal, or no, vice versa. Any immortal character can learn any skill from any mortal. Yeah. So you can also learn skills from equipment that you pick up. Mm-hmm. So what I did is there's an optional dungeon at the end of the game where it literally takes 5 hours. It's a massive fucking dungeon. I leveled up close to 20 times during that dungeon. And by the end of that dungeon, I had enough skills and items where my immortal characters were basically invulnerable to everything. Mm-hmm. So guard condition in disc 4 was not a thing anymore because my immortals could not be touched. They absorbed every elemental spell and they had defense boosts against physical damage. And then you end up with 4 immortal characters and you have 5 people in your party at a time. And then my mortal character just had some items to help them out too. So when you got to those scarier enemies that caused you to rely on the guard condition to keep your party alive, because I had put in that time in that super dungeon, my immortals were basically like invincible. Yeah. So there's that too.
There is that. That's so funny because basically on your anti-recommendation, that is the one piece of side content that I did not touch, is that optional dungeon. The only reason I went in is I sprinted in there to get the last treasure hunt, and I turntailed. I ran away from every encounter that I had in there because I was like, I don't want to deal with this. I just want to get the last treasure. But yeah, I almost all of the time I was rocking 3 and 2 or 2 and 3 so that I had 3 immortals and 2 mortals, or the other way around. Because I really liked spreading out, because also there are times when your party will be split up. And so you can't just rely on, and also there is no passive experience in this game. The character has to be in the active party in order to get the experience points and the skill points. So I was doing a lot of spreading out, and I finished the game where no one was above level 51. And I think your levels were in the 70s.
Yeah, I was definitely around level 75 at the end of the game. Both times I played it. And I did the super dungeon because I remember doing it the first time I played and remembered how invincible I was at the end. And so I was like, well, I've got time before recording. I've got podcasts to listen to. Let's just throw those on. I'll follow a walkthrough because that dungeon's fucking... It would take 10 hours if I didn't have a walkthrough to get through it. So I just, that's what I did. just taking advantage of the systems they gave me. If they didn't want my characters to be invincible, they shouldn't have made the systems this way.
Yeah.
So
honestly, I was like, the way that the Immortal characters work is just elaborated on. They have a certain number of slots that you can equip with these skills that you're learning. And for the vast majority of the game, because of the amount of skill slots you get, like as consumable items, most Immortals aren't going to be above 8. And then all of a sudden at the end of the game, they give you items that allow you to learn skills that attach dozens more skill slots to your Immortals. And
that's a lot.
I was a little bit disappointed. I liked having to pick and choose, but the game was telling me like, hey, here's a slot plus 9, here's a slot plus 20, use these. And I was just like, all right, I'm going to use them. And so now all of my Immortals are kind of everything characters. It's odd the way that they just like, they restrain you for so long, and then when they finally let you loose, they let you really loose to just break the game wide open if you have the patience.
Yeah, I do agree with you that I think that, well, I wouldn't have missed it because it wouldn't have existed, but I think that had they limited your slots to like, maybe 10 or 15 maybe at the end of the game, and like you said early in the game, those consumable items that give you an extra skill slot are like the best reward for exploring or like poking around in corners and dungeons. Those are excellent rewards for exploring. Had they kept that and just been like, you can get more of these by doing side quests or something like that, but not let you turn your characters into these just, unstoppable forces of nature at the end, it would have made for a lot more interesting decision-making for how to build these characters at the end. Because the way that my characters worked, my 4 Immortal characters could basically do anything. They were immune to everything, and especially my mages could do any type of magic you ever wanted them to do, in addition to never taking damage from anything. So, for me, who took full advantage of these systems, I found that for combat utility, it made the mortal characters a complete afterthought. It was like, my Immortals are gods, so we'll put all of them in the party, and then I have to put a 5th party member in, so one of the mortal characters can go in there and use items if they need to, but they're not going to need to.
Yeah.
So they're just kind of there.
One of the mortal characters gets a double item skill that lets him use 2 items in one turn. And if I was rocking your setup, that would be the only mortal that I use. Yeah,
exactly. So, the good part is that, I think that they tried to make you avoid this at least for a long time by making the only way Immortal characters learn those skills, at least most of the good skills for a while, is from the mortal characters. And they have to be in the party together for them to learn those skills. So you can't just go all Immortal characters for the whole game.
Right.
Basically only at the end.
Right.
So, the other part about combat, and this is something that could keep you engaged or could really piss you off as the combat goes, depending on who you are and how you feel about this kind of thing, is the ring system. So anytime you do a physical attack in this game, which is important because Kaim and Seth are physical attackers, and they'll be in your party for most of the game. Anytime you do that, you have a little timing mini game, a la, a Super Mario RPG or something like that. The way that this is presented on screen is that you have a big ring that is closing in around a small ring, and when they overlap, you have to hold down the trigger when it starts and let it go when they overlap. And if you do that, you'll do some bonus damage, and depending on what items you have on your characters, you might get some bonus, status effect or extra elemental damage or something like that. All of these items have special properties, like this one's more effective against mechanical enemies, or this one has the sleep status effect on it, and often several of those. So building out your characters with what items you put on and then doing that timing thing in combat is really important for this combat system if you want to do the most damage that you can. And in tough fights can make the difference between this fight lasting 15 turns versus 14, which is a big deal when it's a tough enemy. So how do you feel about this? I got thoughts, but I'll let you go first.
It's weird. It has a lot in common with like Legend of Dragoon and with like Squall's Gunblade in Final Fantasy VIII. But feelplus, who was the studio that was in charge of the battle system because of the way that this game was made, where Sakaguchi wanted to shop out the gameplay side of things a little bit. Mm-hmm. It was made up of ex-employees from Saknoth/Nautilus, who were the team that did Kudelka and then the Shadow Hearts games. And in the Shadow Hearts games, the Judgment Ring system, the button presses become a lot more complex because the different like sections that you can hit the button in all start to do different things, and they're bigger or smaller and whatever. In this game, the actual timing, you can expand the timing with some rings of what constitutes a perfect hit. But for the most part, it's the exact same mechanic every single time. And it's just what it does when you get a perfect. So based on, how robust the Judgment Ring gets in Shadow Hearts, I found that the mechanical simplicity of this was pretty disappointing. And then the other thing that was disappointing is that it is only the basic attack command that this affects. And so spells and skills have no timing component and are not related to the ring system whatsoever. And so it's only going to be your front row characters who are hitting attack that need to have these rings equipped. And I think that that's kind of a half measure that is really disappointing in a game that has a lot of very interesting combat engine choices.
Yeah, on one hand, it does make pressing attack more interesting, both from you being engaged in what's happening on screen, even if it is kind of cheap, but also from like building your characters out where you're like, I'm fighting this boss, it's a robot. You can switch these in combat anytime with no penalty. So it's like, okay, let me switch in a ring that gives me more damage to mechanical enemies. And now it might be in my best interest to not have Kaim use casting support because Kaim can actually do some damage to this thing. Whereas, the mages can do their own thing. They can help out too, but like it makes pressing attack more interesting in a couple of ways. The problem with this is, as you said, it's exactly the same for 50 plus hours in the entire game. And the visual representation of what this is, I hate the ring closing in over the smaller ring. It's very hard to like time out. Like I could get a good or perfect every time, but I couldn't tell you like, why did I not get a perfect this time?
Yeah.
Like, and it shows you like a number on the screen and like there's some, if you release the trigger when the number reaches 34 or something and you'll be closer to a perfect or something like that. And like it's not intuitive. And so I like these timing based hit systems in a lot of games, like in a Paper Mario or a Sea of Stars or something like that. I like these. But what those games do is they mix it up. Every attack is different in those games, and it's the exact same in this game for 50 plus hours. So I like the mechanical like choices behind what rings you use, but I don't really like using the rings. By about like hour 30, I was very much over this. Like if I could have put a ring on that said you don't have to do the timing game anymore, I would have just done that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it works against itself because it's a blessing that the game allows you to re-equip in combat without any turn penalty.
Yeah.
But like, you know, I'm going in and fucking with menus and equipping stuff for an additional 200 damage if I get a perfect. Like, it becomes very diminishing returns. And yeah, exactly. It's like the reason why I brought up Shadow Hearts' Judgment Ring evolving is that evolution was key to keeping that interesting, and they just do not do enough to keep the ring system interesting. And I also completely agree with you that I think that I can tell where the perfect mini section in the rings are, but the rings move so fast and the timer counts down so fast. With input lag on LCD screens and input lag for wireless controllers and all of that, like, I don't know what the perfect timing is. I never got bad after a certain point because there are 3 ratings. It's bad, good, and perfect. But with the Gunblade, I was able to pull off a perfect Gunblade every single time after a while. And I was never able to pull off a perfect every single time. And so, yeah, it becomes rote after a while in a gross way. Yeah.
Agreed.
So before we move to the spoiler wall, there are a couple of quick things that I want to touch on. One is a point that we didn't really get into in the dungeon section, but I want to point out, these dungeons all have a gimmick and a puzzle like aspect to them that makes them each mechanically distinct. They all go on for at least 2 screens too long. Every single one of them. But they also all feel, it's like, oh, this one is about, you know, making sure that the staircases get moved in a certain order. Or this one is about, like, keeping a firefly with me so that I can see the hidden holes in the ground so I don't have to repeat sections of the dungeon. And I appreciated that because dungeons with mechanical interest are not a thing that a lot of JRPGs do anymore. I wish they were paced better. I wish that they were each only about 2/3 as long, but I enjoyed that there was something there for me to do in those dungeons.
Yeah, I do appreciate that there's thought behind like how you engage with the dungeon for sure. The problem for me is that if you fuck up in at least the 2 dungeons that are popping into my head, your punishment is you fall down and you have to run back up, do more random encounters and try that section again. And so I don't love that, especially the one with the fireflies. Like the backtracking that is put on you if you fuck up is a lot. And it's like several minutes of running up hills and doing random battles just to get back to that spot.
And sometimes trudging through like things that slow your movement down, like sludge and wind too. God. Yeah.
The dungeons they were not my favorite part of the game for sure. We'll say that.
Yeah. I am warmer, I think, than you, but I agree with all of your points about them. I just feel a little bit fonder of them. Finally, the last big generalities thing that I want to talk about is the towns are town-ass towns. So this game has 3 major cities and then several smaller settlements. Each of the game's 3 major cities has a very distinct character and like a lot of different places to go. There are a lot of buildings you can enter. There are a lot of like different sections to the cities. They're huge. And the game will put you in these towns for long enough that you can actually get a feel for the politics and culture of each place. And then when the world state changes finally in disc 3 and like things that happen that are actively affecting the world, the dialogue will also change to let you know about what the townspeople think of this new state of the world. It's not quite the Trails series amount of unique dialogue, but I was pretty surprised and impressed by how much just new talking you can get. And I would say about 75% of it is flavor, and 25% is like the hint disguised as conversation thing that a ton of the JRPGs otherwise have.
Yeah, I agree. It was a game where I liked talking to NPCs. There were there's always, bound to be a few that don't have a lot to say and you feel like you wasted your time talking to them. But a lot of them do fill out the rest of the world, especially if you're interested in the political plot, which involves these three nations that are, at the very least at odds with each other, or just trying to, figure out what the other one's plotting and stuff like that. The NPCs do a good job of filling that stuff out for sure.
I do love one little bit of like ludonarrative consonance that feels very half-assed, but is also very funny to me. Is that a lot of the NPCs that live in houses, you talk to them and they'll say, "I've got a bunch of trash in this house. Go ahead and just like take whatever you find." That it's like, hey, don't feel bad about being a loot goblin in this game. The NPCs want you to be.
Exactly. Well, you're already in my house. You might as well take some of the shit that I don't want, right?
Yeah. And then the last tiny little bit is that the town NPCs are also they're named with an adjective before their name, so you know what they're about. So it's like lethargic Semol, or on edge Satka, or like smug soldier. Those tickled me a lot of the time.
Yeah, those are good. So before we get into spoilers, as we do, we always like to answer the question for everybody. What type of person would you recommend play Lost Odyssey after about an hour and 45 minutes of non-spoiler discussion?
Wow.
People should have a good idea of what this game's about, but if we can boil it down, what kind of person do you think should try this game out?
Gosh. So people who are like really interested in like the historiography of games and like games as meta commentary, I think will find a lot to like in this game. But I think generally anyone who loves the 32-bit era of JRPGs, kind of the golden age of Sony Square JRPGs, and wants a very pretty one, will find a lot of things to love about this game. It was, like I said at the top, intentionally dated at the time and is even more dated now, but it trucks in things that a ton of modern JRPGs are not that interested in anymore, and it does most of those things at least decently well. There is a lot of tedium, especially in the connective tissue of this game, but I feel like anybody who has a taste for it will find a ton of really like touching small moments and character turns, even when the big, like the plot is disappointing, and it nails those emotional moments more than its peers do. So if you already know that you're kind of in the pocket for this type of game, I think you're going to love it. If you can stomach a little or a medium amount of genre tedium, I think that the whole is less than the sum of its parts, but the parts are so good sometimes.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. I think part of the reason this game is held up with a lot of like the greats of the genre is that just most people are not able to play it anymore. So the people who like it are the ones who talk about it the most. That being said, I do think this is good, but this is one of those games that I revisited, a game that I loved when I was younger, and I revisited it for the purposes of doing the podcast, and it's just not as good as I remembered it while still being good. So like if I make a top 5 JRPGs list, it's not in that list anymore, we'll say. And I think that like you hit on some stuff as far as recommendations go. If you like this genre and you want one with a different tone, perhaps, that's exploring a lot of sadder themes, then this is really good, and you'll find a lot of stuff to like in that. But if you don't like this genre, and especially if you don't like it because you think the games are too long, tedious, slow moving, this is not going to change your mind. You have to be in for this type of game. So if you have the patience to get through it, I do think there's a lot to like here. It is just one of those games that didn't hold up to my memory while still being something that I still do appreciate the things that it does well. So, qualified recommendations for Lost Odyssey. And, qualify anytime you recommend a game that's 50 to 70 hours long, there's a qualification to that recommendation anyway. But
for sure.
when we get in the spoiler section soon, there is going to be some really good story stuff that we discuss, and there's going to be some stuff that I think is kind of shitty. So we have a lot to discuss, but before we get into spoilers, we always do our housekeeping, starting with the projects that the guest does. So as at the top, I mentioned that Ryan is a part of the Lightning Strikes Thrice podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to spending a lot of time and zooming way in on JRPGs. So tell everybody, if they're not familiar, what is Lightning Strikes Thrice all about?
Yeah, thank you. So, Lightning Strikes Thrice is, it kind of like splits the difference between a podcast like this and a extensive Let's Play. We go into fine detail on JRPGs. We usually spend about 10 episodes on each one. It's a lot of fun because we can really like dig into really tiny moments and encounter designs and things like that a broader podcast won't be able to get to. Yeah. It's called Lightning Strikes Thrice because we did the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy as the very first thing that we've done. But we have covered Final Fantasy VIII and Shadow Heart's Covenant and the Xenosaga trilogy, which is, I think, some of our best work. We just finished up Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter, which I think was just so much fun to record about. Really criminally underlooked game. And right now we're doing a little, what should be a shorter season on Wizardry 4, which is not actually a JRPG, but, the Wizardry series was extremely influential for JRPGs, and, 4 is kind of a hateful game. And so it's fun to dig into it with, other people who are sharing in our misery. And that is part of the Pitch Drop podcast network. And we have a couple of shows on Patreon. If you go to pitchdrop.cash, one of my co-hosts, Chris Taylor, who is also on the Final Fantasy X podcast, he and I have a long ongoing podcast about Final Fantasy XIV. Some of our hosts also host, shows about different anime, and there is a manga, podcast that releases occasionally as well. And so it's, if you like going into detail about this stuff, I really recommend Lightning Strikes Thrice. And thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. Yeah. And I was going to say, I recommend Lightning Strikes Thrice as well. It's like you said, much more detail in like the fine things that happen throughout the course of playing a game than Tales from the Backlog will ever get into, just the nature of the formats of the show. So if you listen to an episode of Tales from the Backlog and you think, I wish that Dave would just take like 10 to 12 episodes and just, talk about everything that happens as it happens. Well, Lightning Strikes Thrice is the place to go for that sort of thing. And you can bet I've got Final Fantasy 13 on my like list of like the next Final Fantasy game that I play might be 13, might also be 15, because I've, it's been long enough since I played that where I start to have that creeping thought of like, was I wrong about Final Fantasy 15? Maybe I should replay it. It's a weird thing that happens in my head.
Yeah.
So it's a good companion to go along with games like that you're playing. So,
well, thank you.
Give the recommendation, as always, for anyone who's interested in something like that to check the show out. And if you like 14, if you like, anime and stuff like that, the Patreon's cheap. So you are encouraged to go check that out too.
Thanks so much.
I'll put a link down in the show notes so people can easily find the show. And then, for me over here on Tales from the Backlog, we also have a Patreon. If you want to support monetarily, you can do that at patreon.com/realdavejackson. For some bonus episodes every now and then, I do a bonus retro gaming series called Tales from the Way Backlog. I also have polls every month. Trying to remember, what do I do on my Patreon? Polls every month for a game that I play on the show. So if you would like to support, that's patreon.com/realdavejackson. You can join the Discord server, which I think is a nice place to hang out online, talk about games and everything else going on in your life. You can listen to my other show called A Top 3 Podcast, where we do top 3 lists. And ratings and reviews. Yes, if you've enjoyed the episode and you haven't done this before, it's really appreciated if you could leave a rating and or a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, YouTube, likes and subscriptions and stuff like that. That helps. It helps people find the show, and that's what we want. So with all of that, that's a lot of plugs at the end. We're going to take a music break. We're going to come back, and we'll get into full spoilers for Lost Odyssey. All right, Dave here, and while people are filtering out before spoilers begin, I want to take this time to thank the wonderful people who help support the show over on Patreon. And an especially big shout out to Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Chris Copleen, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Ficori, Jill, Jeff, formerly Jerf, Kieran, Soccer, ZNA, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Brian Skirsha, Randall, Jake Martin, Jenny E., and many more. Your support is much appreciated. And with that being said, now we're heading back for spoilers for Lost Odyssey. All right, we're back, and it's full spoilers for Lost Odyssey upcoming, and this is not going to be a chronological walk through the story. We're going to spoil things that are revealed late in Disc 4 in the first bullet point here in the spoiler section. So, again, if you don't want to be spoiled, this is not the place for you. Please consider playing Lost Odyssey and come back, or, I don't know, go read what happens or something like that. Go play the game. It's interesting. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about, and just kind of like setting up what factors into the decisions at the end, is we should talk about why the Immortals are there in the first place. So we have our Immortal characters, Kaim, Sarah, Seth, Ming, and Gungora, who, as it's explained, they don't remember why they're here at the beginning because Gungora wiped their memories, but they're originally... Sort of.
So they all came without their memories as part of the transfer system.
Yes.
And then they lived 970 years, and then Gongora locked their memories of the last 970 years.
Yeah. So as we pick them up, they have lost their memories because of what Gongora did. But they also don't remember what their mission was at the beginning. So they're not from this world. They came to this world. They came to this world because there is a virus, they call it, that's plaguing their world. And the cause they found was in this world that the game takes place in. And we find out they're not actually immortal. They, time just passes super, super slowly for them here, which doesn't explain why Kaim can get hit by a meteor.
Yeah.
But it explains why they don't age, I suppose.
It's that part is, I was like, yeah, okay. Because he gets hit by a meteor. He and Sarah get blown up in a train and then frozen. They die again and again. And they're like, oh, well, they just can't age. You're right. That doesn't get all the way there, but that's fine. So what's revealed is they came to this world to find the cause of this virus. The virus, as they call it in their world, it's kind of like killing their world, is the emotions from the people in the game world, if I'm remembering that right. Which a very JRPG thing to do, to have emotions do this sort of thing. So their mission was to put a stop to it, basically. Now, they forget all about that shit for most of the game. Gungora is the one that remembers all of this. But instead of working toward a cause of all of this, Gungora decides that he wants to use those emotions to make himself more powerful. Like he can turn them into magic energy to make himself more powerful. And then he's going to cut the link between his world and the game world, which I guess would solve the problem if it's not fucked already on the other side. Maybe it's very ambiguous, and that's part of it. That's part of the ending, which we'll get to in a second, that I really like, actually. But yeah, him being like, oh well, I would rather be a god on this world than just a normal person on my home world is kind of his motivation. And it's only interesting because like the cosmology of like what is this energy MacGuffin is such a big part of a lot of JRPGs, and this one, magic energy, kind of sprouted up just 30 years ago, where there was always sort of this latent, low-lying magic energy, and it was actually the home world reestablishing the connection to this world and starting to ask the immortals to return home. That is the thing that amplified the emotions into magic energy. And so it's like they lived, almost 1,000 years without Gongora being able to become a powerful sorcerer. And then he was like, wait, I can become a powerful sorcerer right at the end.
And so the thing with this is that I gave the whole explanation for what's going on. But what you just said right there is the explanation that's given to someone playing Lost Odyssey if they don't go poking around in Gongora's house in an optional side mission in Disc 4. Right. If you don't do that, you just get the Gongora wants to be a god and use the emotions turned into energy to fuel these magical conduits to bring the energy to him so that he can become like a truly immortal god. Yeah. That's what you get. If you go to Gongora's house, and I cannot stress how inconsequential it feels to make the decision to go to Gongora's house in Disc 4. Like, you have no indication that important things will be there. I didn't go there because I was like, why the fuck would I go to his house?
Well, it's weirdly part of Tolton's like get my kingdom back side quest.
His side quest,
which Tolton is my least favorite of all of the player characters, and so there was this big like, I don't want to restore his ass to the throne. Like, I don't care about that.
Is there one of his like magic seals or something like that in Gongora's house?
Yeah, so it's in the backyard of Gongora's mansion, and it is what seals his underground lab where you find all this stuff.
Okay, yeah. So my immortals were gods in combat, so I was like, I don't need Tolton to be good. I don't need his ultimate weapon. I'm not doing this side quest that takes me to, 9 locations around the map. And because we talked about how long it takes to do anything in this game. Yeah. So the prospect of going to get all of these things, I was just like, nope, I'm not doing that. So no indication that I would ever go to Gongora's house. And so you miss out on the interesting part of his motivation. Right. Because like the part that's given to you, Gongora wants to be an immortal god because he found out how good it feels to be powerful or what the fuck ever. Like, that's like the least interesting thing that a villain can be. Oh, yeah. And unless you're Kefka, like you can't live up to that, right?
So, and this is the thing about Gongora for me. First of all, the visual design of Gongora is bad.
Yeah, I think it's boring as hell. Yeah.
I saw a YouTuber describe him as Guy Fieri as an evil sorcerer. But to me, he's like if someone ran Kefka through a Chad filter. He looks like some just like generic military dude, and he is supposed to be this like nihilistic, megalomaniacal evil sorcerer, and he looks nothing like an evil sorcerer. He just looks like a fucking guy, and it makes that incongruence just clang really hard.
Yeah, the two things that I think help Kefka is over Gongora, because they're both mad for power. They both do horrendous shit to the people in the world. Kefka's design as like the court jester is interesting for someone to have this turn. And Kefka's just chaotic evil. Yeah. Gongora is a plotting politician type of evil, while also having access to like this incredible destructive magic, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I do think that like the explanation for what's going on with their homeworld and why Gongora might choose to stay here is more interesting than like, I just want to be a god.
Right.
But you don't get that. It should be part of the main story. I do not understand at all why this is in optional content. It should be in the main story.
I completely agree. And then also it should be more fleshed out. Like it's so clear that the people making this game just didn't care about this stuff nearly as much as the character moments, which in a vacuum is fine. But what I'm about to lay out is not just optional, but it is also not laid out in explicit text. I think it is present within the text. I think that this is stuff that is true about the game. I don't think that I'm like reaching for a meaning that I made up and then grafted on. Mm-hmm. But okay, so the good thing he does is he massacres thousands of people and he manipulates people and like he is an evil guy compared to a lot of JRPG villains. But the difference between this world and the other world is something that the game calls the virus of feeling or the virus of emotions, which suggests that the home world is a lot more stoic. And without memories of that home world and without anything to connect you to that home world, why would you want to go back to it? Mm-hmm. And this virus of feeling infects the 5 immortals who were put here in different ways. Ming starts to feel a tremendous responsibility towards the people she rules. Kaim and Sarah forge attachments and connections with like low-level mortals that show them that this poison of emotion is actually what makes life worth living. And part of this virus of emotion that Gongora talks about is avarice and greed and lust for power, that is also an animating force, a very emotional force in this world. Mm-hmm. And that's what he got drawn to. And so the other 4 got drawn to the other parts of humanity, and he got drawn to, oh, it feels so good to be powerful. And if that was in the game, or it is in the game, but if that was in the game in a way that you could not ignore it, I think that's neat. But it's just literally nowhere. You have to both go to this optional section and then also do some deep thinking about what he's saying. And then it's like, oh. But yeah, you're totally right. For most of the players, it's just going to be, oh, this guy's power hungry. Cool. He's already an immortal, like, mega mage. Why does he also need to be power hungry? Come on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I said early in the game or early in the podcast when we were talking about like the 1,000 Years of Dreams, that the main story, I think, spends too much time focusing on political maneuverings and, treaties and, construction of a new grand staff and mutually assured destruction, which is interesting, like the way that Gongora goes about tricking the people and like the leaders of these nations to kind of not necessarily always go along with him, but just to, not interfere with him so he can go and do everything he wants to do. What this game should have been focusing on is it should have made you really understand, if the point of it all was how these emotions connected with the immortals the whole time. Mm-hmm. It should have really spent time making you understand. I think it does it most with Kaim and Sarah. But what is Seth's real connection to this world other than her kid? That's basically
That's it.
Like, yeah. She has a kid. Ming is connected with her subjects as the queen. She feels a responsibility and she is a just ruler, or she wants to be, of them. But we don't get as much time dedicated to the immortals, how they interact with this world, and how they feel about their immortality. Gongora and Kaim are the 2 that we get the most about. Kaim's is in the 1,000 Years of Dreams. Gungora's is in this in disc 4 when you find out like what his whole deal is. But like you have a big scene like with Cook and Mac when you first meet them and you do the funeral and stuff like that. And that like cracks Kime's shell a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you have like most of disc 2, all of disc 3, and then most of disc 4, where the theme of immortality is not really explored a whole lot outside of the 1,000 Years of Dreams.
Right. And also the ultimate theme of both the 1,000 Years of Dreams and also the ending of the game is that history is going to happen. There will be wars. There will be death. That shit is going to repeat. Civilizations will rise and fall. New hatreds and loves will be forged. What matters is the people you connect with. Yeah. And I love that in the 1,000 Years of Dreams and also the ending, but it undercuts a lot of the plot of the game because the point of those sections is, yeah, world-changing events are going to fucking happen. People are going to die. Life goes on. And all we're witnessing in the main story is one particular permutation of a crisis point that life will eventually move on from.
You talking about with Liram and Cook and Mac?
Yeah, both with Liram, Cook, and Mac, and also just like the whole, like, you know, how say the Eastern Tribe is already a civilization that utilized magic and it ended up destroying them, the spirit magic. It's this idea that all this stuff happens in cycles, and mostly what people do is live through them or not. And so, yeah, that's why the small character moments work so much better is because I think the thesis of the 1,000 Years of Dreams is that the main plot of Lost Odyssey is just another repetition of the same thing that life always does. And so it's just sort of like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, you basically could condense the storyline with Mac and Cook and them grieving the loss of their mother. That could be, it is almost like a 1,000 Years of Dreams story blown up into an entire storyline, basically. And that's the one they focused on because those are characters that are closest to Kime. Although I think there is at least 1,000 Years of Dreams that's about a past family that Kime had.
Yeah.
Before this family.
Yeah.
But those characters are there, and that storyline is there, I think, to crack Kime's shell a little bit and give him something to care about, because he's just kind of wandering before they meet them. And even like Kime and Seth and Jansen get sent off together, but Kime's just like, whatever, this is just another fucking thing I gotta do, and you know, I'm gonna do it because I don't have any. What else am I gonna do? I can't die, so we're gonna go do this. And then he finds his grandkids Cook and Mac, and he finds his daughter Liram, who is on her deathbed. And it's important because one of the first memories that Kime remembers is he remembers a small girl jumping or falling off of a seaside cliff as he looks on helplessly. And then it's revealed that's Liram. So he thought she was dead, but he finds her on her deathbed. They reconnect for a little bit, and then they have like this wonderful sequence where like you meet them, they reconnect, she dies, they have a very long funeral sequence there that's really, really good. It's one of the best story parts in the game, where you're getting to know Cook and Mac, and then you go through this funeral procession. And then I really like how this shows you the difference between how Kime would view death in these 1,000 Years of Dreams that you've probably read several of by now. And you get the sense that he's fairly detached from all of this. And then you get brought back into the mortal world and how people who don't experience this over and over and over again react to it with Cook and Mac.
Yeah. And I agree with that. And the other thing that it does is it's important that Gongora, he basically lied to Kaim and made it seem like Lirim was already dead.
Yeah.
As a way to break his spirit, to lock his memories away. And every time that Gongora does something where it's like, okay, these other immortals can't die. How can I hurt them? Oh, I manipulate things so that they have to witness the people who they love dying. And so he does that with Kaim and Sarah by pretending to kill Lirim and then hiding her away from them. He does that with Seth, in which we only find out through her dreams. He does that with Ming, with her people. And those are the times where I was like, oh, damn, Gongora, he sucks. We got to take care of him because he's doing things that are actually affecting the characters emotionally.
Yeah, for sure. So I got the sense, like, in this is pretty early when you meet Cook and Mac. Like, I got the sense, okay, Kaim's got something to care about again, but the one thing that you're taking from the 1,000 Years of Dreams that you're reading is that Cook and Mac, they're mortal, they're gonna die. And so part of it is, like, Kaim is setting himself up for more heartbreak down the line in some form, you feel like, right? And this is something that, like, plays into the choice at the end of the game, which is, you know, the Immortals are given the opportunity, or at least not like on screen given the choice or something, but they're presented with the idea that they might not belong in this world. And even if they felt like they belong in this world, do they want to keep going through this over and over again? Because you're introduced to these characters. Kaim and Sarah get Cook and Mac to care about. Ming eventually falls in love with Jansen, which we can talk about if you want to. And Seth is reunited with her son, Ced. Ced, not Sid, because it's not Final Fantasy, but it's Ced.
Oh my god, he is a fucking mechanic genius who pilots an airship. Oh my god, I just put that together.
Yeah. So what I think the game is doing, so it introduces to you through the 1,000 Years of Dreams how much living for 1,000 years would really fucking suck. And then it gives all of the immortal characters somebody to now care about, a mortal to care about again. Yeah.
And it's saying that it's worth it anyway. And I think that is part of the meta text of this game is Sakaguchi looking back on all of his own heartbreak and how much it sucks to get older and watch people that you love die as part of aging and being like, yeah, this pain is why the joy that we feel is so powerful. And so it's all worth it. And I really do think that's beautiful. Like, I think that the ultimate, like the ending choice of the game, even though it didn't have enough like runway outside of the 1,000 Years of Dreams, it was very affecting for me to watch them all make this choice to continue to live in the world.
Okay, let's just talk about the ending then, since we've brushed up against it a couple of times. So I got the sense that what this game was trying to tell me was that if given the opportunity that this should end, that like basically that they shouldn't be here for all of this, like again and again and again and again. I got the feeling that what the game was saying was that immortality is a curse, and that when given the choice at the end, Keim's initial idea to leave is the correct one for him. Now, the issue with that I'm kind of seeing now is, and you brought it up earlier, we have no idea what the other side is like.
Yeah.
If they were to return home, they've been away for, I don't know how long it is in like their home year's time, but
it's about a year is what Gongora says in one of his audio diaries.
Okay, so it hasn't been that long, but there has, that world was dying, and for a year then of their time will have continued to decay based on all of the emotions going on when Gongora, kills an entire nation and all of that stuff. So that's the issue, I guess, is I thought the game was saying that the correct choice would be for the Immortals to leave and rest, basically. Even though I guess you were right that we don't know what's on the other side. It could be worse.
And I think that the fact that you took that as a takeaway and I kind of took the opposite is baked in. I think it is supposed to be deliberately both ambiguous and bittersweet.
Well, they tell you at the end, like what you took away from it, like the reason that Keim decided to stay, and Ming and Sarah all decided to stay, is what you said. They all made that choice. So like it's obvious that that's what the game is saying. No, the characters made this choice to do this. It just, to me, seemed a little bit like the game was preparing you for the whole time to just be like, look at all of these 50 examples of why being immortal would fucking suck, and these characters deserve a break. And then at the end, when given the opportunity to finally do that, they don't.
And it's, okay, would you rather live forever but have the ability to feel, or go back to your home world that is maybe way more emotionless and, live out the rest of your natural life and die, but, and rest. But it is the wrinkle that it is emotions that are foreign to this other world really throws a wrench into a lot. And it is very much like, well, they were alive for maybe 35 years in their home world and then 1,000 years in this other world without any memory of the home world. Why would they choose the home world? But you're right that like it does suck to be immortal, and there's a lot of pain, but there is also so much humanity. There are a ton of tender moments in the 1,000 Years of Dreams, and he does become a more emotional creature after he meets Cook and Mac and has young people to follow and live for. So yeah, I do think that it's a double-edged sword, and it's not necessarily satisfying for them, for three of them, because Seth sacrifices herself in order for Gongora to no longer be a threat. So the three that are still around, making that choice, it doesn't feel good, but it does feel right to me.
So the way that you've laid it out, it does make more sense to me now why they would choose it. They choose the romantic option at the end, right? All of the pain, and the pain that's upcoming, again, because Jansen, Mac, and Cook are all mortal, they're all going to die, and that's going to fucking suck. And then we're just going to keep going through this, because I think the link got severed. Like, I think this is a permanent choice, right? So they are basically signing themselves up for more of this. They know what this choice means, but it's the more romantic choice rather than the practical choice, which I got the sense in, like, after Seth sacrifices herself, there was like a brief moment on the boat afterwards where I was like, Keim's kind of jealous that she like put an end to all of this. Yeah,
you're right. He has a little bit of like, should have been me.
Yeah. or just at the very least, like, son of a bitch, like,
Yeah.
we're doing this. So it did seem like it flew against like the main theme that I was taking from the game. But when laid out that the homeworld is more emotionless, and so like that's where they're finding the value, is in like the emotion, the love, all of that. And the fact that if they got memory wiped when they came here, they would get memory wiped when they go back.
Yeah.
Right? So like, it's not like they're taking the knowledge and love and experiences with them. I think maybe they would understand that, and that plays into their choice.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a ton of respect for the ending of this game for not being easy. And what complicates that is that it feels easy and cheap if you didn't do enough of the side content to understand why it is not the easy choice. And that, again, I think it's like, you need to have enough of the 1,000 Years of Dreams. You need to, like, talk to enough people in the world. I really enjoyed going and beating the super boss that's in Sarah's old sorceress mansion, like that that is built out of her lingering sadness and rage. Like, there's it's not just mechanical stuff that's optional, like we've talked about. It's also just like a huge chunk of themes and stuff. And so it might have been that I also would have been like, oh, I think I just got rug pulled if the ending was not playing on the stuff that I found in the game that is what kept me really connected to it. I think I would have been like, huh, instead of like, oh, yeah, woof, yeah, huh. It really, yeah, I dug it. Again,
all of that, like, ground that your take on the ending is standing on the ground that optional content provides, which should not be optional content. And so, like, I think that if you miss that, again, you might be even more baffled by this choice. And so I agree with you. I respect I even respect the idea, if this is your idea, that these characters made the wrong choice at the end. If you think they made the wrong choice, that's still an interesting ending to the game. I came into this recording with the idea that they made a choice that doesn't line up with the themes that the game was setting up. And I think that that's still the case, but now I understand more of the rationale for their choice, where, like, I was coming into this being like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, this goes against what the game was trying to say up until this point. And now it's more of I understand. I still think they probably made the wrong choice. I think that Kaim deserves a rest after all of this. And so does Seth and Ming and all of them. But it does make a bit more sense. The question to me now is, do you think that the game set this up adequately to, like, prepare people that this might be the choice that they made?
No, I don't. Because I think the main plot is the what, and the 1,000 Years of Dreams and some of the optional content is the why. You need the why for the what to hit. And I think that by bifurcating it like that and making basically all of the emotional content of the game, except for Liram and like her funeral and stuff, her death and funeral, by making all of that stuff optional, it makes it tough to connect with. And it makes some of the setup seem very incongruous. So yeah, to answer your question simply, no, I don't. And it's only because I was diving deep into this game for a podcast, where it was like, all right, I have to take notes. I have to do some deep thinking about this game. I enjoy that mode, but I had to make this game homework in order to get as much as I got out of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you also have to, I guess you also have to make that leap that I think that given the choice before he meets Cook and Mac and Liram, Kaim would have gone, given the choice. And you also have to make the leap that this is enough for him to change his mind. And I think that when it was presented that they might leave, I think Ming was always on board that she wanted to stay because she wanted to be the queen and she wanted to take care of the people, and because she loves Jansen. And I think Seth was down to leave, but wanted to finish business with Gongora first. And then Kaim was also on the side of we should leave because we don't belong here. Our presence invites turmoil and chaos here. So I think he said that there are things in the world that he'll miss, but that he was looking at it in that more practical way. And then he changes his mind. And hey, that's what people do when they are emotional, right? If emotion is a theme here, when people are emotional, they make decisions that might not be the most practical, right? So here we go. Real quick, before we talk about 1,000 Years of Dreams, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Jansen and Ming. So.
Basically, I think that it has one of the worst setups for a romance ever.
I agree.
Which is this like sniveling little ladies' man who does dirty jobs for Gongora and only changes that when he realizes that he has also been manipulated by Gongora. But he goes and he drugs and kidnaps a 1,000-year-old queen because he thinks that she's really hot, and then it turns out that she's an incredible judge of character, and she let herself get drugged and kidnapped by this guy to measure if he was a good person or not. And it's like, Ming, his actions make it sound like he's not, like, just on the surface. And then they have the big Eyes on Me love song.
Oh my God. Yeah, I forgot about that shit. Jesus.
The song is so bad. It's like 10 times worse than Eyes on Me, which I already don't love.
It's,
But you didn't have any backstory, like any relationship building between her being like, haha, you think that you're a slime ball, but I know that you're a good man. And then there's nothing on that relationship. And then we get this big romance scene. And then eventually on the deck of the White Boa, they kiss and he gets all flabbergasted and stammers. He's like, but I'm not a good person. I've been trying to show you that I'm not a good person. I didn't expect you to fall for me for real. And she's like, well, I fell for you for real. And he's like, but I'm gonna die. Doesn't that make this relationship like bad? And she's like, let me decide that. That scene worked so hard on me, and I don't know why, because I hated their romance for the first 2/3 of the game. And then that one scene, I was like, oh, that's sweet. Okay, I like that. And I'm trying to reconcile that because I don't think they do enough groundwork to get there. But once they got there, that scene in itself is well acted enough and well written enough where I was like, okay, they work for me now. But it was after they had the love ballad scene. Like the timing and the pacing makes no sense. But ultimately I was like, all right, I'm on board for them, even though I was not on board for most of the runtime.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I think that the sequence of them getting together is like the least believable couple origin story ever, right?
Yeah.
But once they are together, especially what you said, where Ming's mind is, ties in with how she views immortality and her relationship with mortals and things like that. And what she values out of the experience, and just shows that she is not afraid of this, or maybe she is afraid, but she thinks that it's worth it. And so when Ming decided to stay at the end of the game, that made more sense to me because she'd been doing this. She'd been setting that up for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, their origin of like why Ming fell in love with him, it's not great for sure. And then, yeah, special shout out to that song. It's terrible. It's out of place. It's like, it happens at one of like the most desolate and bleak parts in the story too.
Yeah. It's where everything just fell apart. Like everything.
It's worse than any song in Final Fantasy X too. So if you like this part, play Final Fantasy X too. I like that. Yeah. Anyway, we had talked a lot about the motivation for Kaim and Sarah to stay behind, but not a lot of the motivation for Ming. And Ming's is the one where I was like, it does make sense that she's staying for sure.
Yeah.
Because she said that a while ago. Like, she's set on this. There is I think it's one of her memories where she basically talks about a few times where her trusted advisors become people who try to stab her in the back as the queen. And it's just this cycle of like, the person who helped me put down the previous coup attempt then attempts the next coup as they, get power hungry and stuff. And like, she's made peace with the fact that this is just how it works.
Yeah.
On that angle. And then that scene with Jansen where she's like, this is my choice to be with you, despite the fact that you're mortal. I've made peace with that. So, you let me worry about that. So
yeah,
her motivation to stay was well grounded, I think.
I'm glad you agree with that. As a side note, just on her character being the queen, one thing that is a little disappointing to me about this game is that it is very overall skeptical of power structures and people who seek power.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But it also has a noble queen who has been ruling for 1,000 years as like the best ruler in the game. And one of the big side quests is to get this naive, easily manipulated fail son of a royal restored on the throne in a way that makes him feel like he deserves the throne. So there are two like royal restoration fantasies in this game that does not think very highly of royals overall. And I think that's a little bit hypocritical and kind of disappointing.
It's interesting. I don't agree about Ming because Ming never had aspirations of power. Ming got memory wiped by Gungora, and when she woke up from getting her memory wiped, Gungora's like, "You're the queen of this place." And she was like, "Okay, I'm the queen." And she's apparently a good person, so she's a just ruler. But her rise to being the queen wasn't because she desired the great power of being the queen. So when you compare her with Gungora, who's the biggest example of this, but also with Tolton, and I guess there's that other leader in the other nation who...
There's the King of Gotza, who I really love that sub-story, and I don't think it was done justice in the end because it's kind of pushed to the side, but yeah.
Yeah, doesn't really matter at the end. And that's part of my issue with that whole political plot line in general. There's a lot of maneuvering and there's a lot of this is the king of this nation and we're going to set up this treaty, but that doesn't really matter. It's all about Gungora amassing power. And once he has the power, you could forget the names of the countries if you wanted to. That doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
Later on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I like how devastating it is. It sounds edgy to say I like how many people die, but I like that there are actual consequences to this collapse.
Yeah.
And one of the things that disappoints me so much is that, so the King of Gotza, I don't remember his name, but he is someone who actually was rescued, his life was saved by Kaim and Sarah long, long ago. And they tried to instill in him the values of being just. And he realized, I have to compromise some of those values because my life is finite. And if I want to do the best possible work that I can do for my subjects, I'm going to have to live in unnobly sometimes. And I thought that was an extremely good theme to chew on, and that the game does not chew on it. It just presents it and then moves on.
And he dies pretty quickly after you learn his whole deal too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with you. The game's overall stance on people who desire power is not great. And the game does not think highly of that for sure. Because the main person you see that through is Gungora. I did not do Tolton's side quests because I didn't give a shit about Tolton as a character.
Yeah.
And again, we talked, I said it before, but like also the time aspect of how long it would take to go find all those seals.
Yeah.
I wasn't interested in that. But I also, like, if I really cared about Tolton, I would have done it, but I didn't.
Mm-hmm. It's with Ming, I think you're right that she's different because she does not desire power. But I just personally, I'm just upset that it's a monarchy again. You know, it's like monarchies. I don't believe in them. So when a game does, when it's also skeptical of power, I'm always like, something isn't squaring for me. But you are totally right that like she is a just person who used to hide from the fact that she was more powerful than others, but then she was like, oh, I can use this power to protect people and get them to live well, and that's what I'm going to do. And I think that is very different from Tolton or Gongora.
Yeah, for sure. Let's finish this out by talking about our favorite 1,000 Years of Dreams sequences, because we've already talked, about how these sequences inform how we should feel about the character's choices at the end. But I do want to like shine a light on some noteworthy sequences in here because they are really, really good. And even if we have already discussed like the lessons you might take from them, there are just a lot of quality things in here. So what were some of your either takeaways about them in general, now that we can say anything, or specific stories that you enjoyed in particular?
So by and large, they are meditations on war and loss. And it's usually Kaim talking to someone who is mortal and is in the middle of some fight or some, conflict. And, I really enjoyed the moments of humanity within that war, because I think one of the big themes is that history doesn't remember the reasons why people grow to hate and kill each other. Hatreds will be forgotten. The world will change. New hatreds will show up in their place. So it becomes kind of cynical about the arcs of grand history while being also very humane in its perspective. It values relationships over history. And it's either about Kaim showing kindness to somebody and gaining humanity through that connection, or Kaim witnessing other kindnesses being like dealt with. And so it's like kind of, if one of the themes is immortality sucks, it's because the other theme is the finiteness of life is what makes it worth living, and its precious and temporary nature is what makes it powerful. And so just for a couple of examples, I think the one that devastated me the most, that made me like, that gut punched me the most, is Bright Rain.
Yeah.
Where a child who's been like isolated on an island his whole life is fascinated by these clouds, and he thinks it must be so beautiful outside the island, and Kaim knows that it is artillery fire that is going to come for this island, and the kid has no idea what it's about to be like, and the artillery fire, the rain of blood happens way sooner, and the kid runs out in it, thinking that it's like this beautiful rainstorm, and is obliterated. That one wrecked me. But then the three that made me go like, "Aw," the most, in terms of just like, oh my gosh, there is like some real powerful human stuff here. The Bread of Grandma Koto, where this woman refuses to move out of her farmhouse, even though there's war happening all around her, and it's because she just needs to make bread for her son, and then her son dies, and Kaim is the one who eats the bread. the ranking of lives where Kaim is like military police and is in a society where there is a horrible illness, but there's only a finite amount of pills, and this soldier is going to desert and run and give the pill to his son, but then a girl on the street is like, my brother is dying, and he decides to give up his son's opportunity at life. And then the tea house owner in, I think it's called the Stones of Destiny, the Stones of something, but he's very cynical because he's like, people go on a pilgrimage to this river that makes people, this waterfall that makes people hallucinate as stones rain down on their body. And if they get scared and jump off, they freeze to death in the lake. And this guy sets up this tea house at the bottom of the lake to pick up the broken ones, basically, and sees someone failing and dying and ends up sacrificing himself in order to save the life of one of these quote unquote weak people. Those all spoke to people wanting to help each other and share things with each other. And despite the bleak, dark world that they found themselves in, finding moments of connection and moments in which like these people who are violent are able to retain tenderness really affected me.
Yeah, two of those are what I had written down too as like particularly affecting ones. Bright Rain, I think, is probably the most like shocking and fucked up and like interesting to read of the ones that I got to. The Bread of Grandma Kodo is good in that other direction. And it's interesting. You made a really good point that like, I think the 1,000 Years of Dreams is there to show you all that Kaim has seen and like lived through and how much it would suck to basically go through this all the time. It's also interesting to me that in most of these, Kaim is a mercenary of some kind. So it's like, this guy can't die. He's immortal. What is his place in the world? He's just going to go fight forever, basically. So that was interesting to me. But like, so they're showing you how being immortal would suck through these, but they're also, like you said, showing you these very zoomed in connections, often just between Kaim and one other person in this grand scale of like a war or something going on. But you have an even bigger perspective because the framing of these 1,000 Years of Dreams is this is a tiny memory in Kaim's immortal life. So you already have this big perspective that this is a drop in the bucket of Kaim's life experiences here. But we're going to zoom in so close to either show you how much this fucking sucked or how much, or how like close or how tender it can be. That's why I like The Bread of Grandma Kodo so much, because that's one where Kaim makes a very quick, like, we'll say like short-lived connection with somebody. But Kaim goes out of his way he tries to get her to evacuate. She doesn't do it. She refuses to. And he goes out of his way to try and steer the fighting away from her house, or just try to like, maybe if he knows that she's gonna, her house is gonna get, rampaged over at some point soon, just, be there and give her someone to talk to because her son died in the fighting. Another one like that there was a story about like, I think it's like, it's called the Loose-Lipped Mercenary or something like that. And it's about a mercenary on Kaim's side. It's like the night before a battle and everyone thinks that they're going to die. And so everyone's like really quiet. Nobody wants to say anything. And there's this new recruit who's super nervous and just like won't shut up.
Oh yeah.
And like Kaim these also show that like Kaim could become this like ultra callous person who doesn't give a shit about anybody because they're all going to die tomorrow. I'm not going to die. So why would I take the time with these people? And he basically talks to them and helps the kid defect to live another day. He's not going to last much longer, but just having that like perspective and like those close relationships. So that was a good one. The other one I wrote down, which is kind of the opposite. It's not Kaim forming a connection with a person. It's just Kaim. It's just there to show you his perspective and how people are so consumed with like short-term stuff. And obviously Kaim's not going to worry about short-term stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the tragedy of the Butcher General, which is this general who is just going through razing the countryside and just killing everybody who might possibly rise against him in the future, you know, not satisfied with killing the soldiers, but any witnesses, because those witnesses are going to grow up and hate me. Mm-hmm. So we need to kill them too. And so like he basically just butchers everybody. And then it turns into this really fucked up body horror story.
Yeah.
Where he has like plants growing out of his skin and shit. And I was like, that's awesome. And, but like that message that like the way to, I mean, you shouldn't be killing all these people anyway, but the most incorrect way to do this is to kill everybody to try to stop someone from rising up against you before it can possibly happen, because it's just going to make things worse.
Yeah.
And that's what Kaim knows, and Kaim can't convince him of this. And the guy eventually gets consumed by these plants, and it's really fucked up and cool.
It is. I'm really glad that you pointed that one out, because I think that it shows how not one note these dreams are. That there's room for some dark comedy in there. There's also room for some like very good morality tale body horror. Like, yeah, it's reading the descriptions of all the plants growing out of his body and how they were all screaming. Like, that was deeply fucked up. I loved that one. I totally agree.
Yeah, that one was fun. There's another one that just kind of shows you Kaim's immortal perspective that I liked, is when he's locked in prison and there's like, you're in this country that has like this caste system basically, and you have all the losers that they call, I think they actually call them the losers in the town, who are locked up in jail, and they all want to like break out and stuff like that. And Kaim just kind of knows that this regime is not going to last, because he's lived through these kind of things before. And so it shows you his perspective. You get into a little bit of politics. You eventually see this revolution happen. They're the ones that break him out of jail at the end of it. And they are the ones who were put down by this society, but during the revolution, during the riots, they show kindness toward people in need when they could have just been bloodthirsty at the end of that. So I thought that was a good one too. I felt complicated about that one, because I agree. It's really, really good and beautiful. And also that was the one where I was like, okay, this works in allegory and story, but not in real life. Because if I were a political prisoner who was just going to go from the child prison to the adult prison, and I had an opportunity to break out, I would not go put myself back into prison just to convince the people who were not in prison that I'm actually a pretty good person. Yeah, you're right about that, for sure. Yeah.
But as a story, I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, these are all beautiful, these 1,000 Years of Dreams. And I don't know if you have others that you wanted to bring up. Those were just a selection of the ones. There's 33 of them. And I went to look through some of them on YouTube earlier today to refresh, and yes, they're quite long. Like, you could easily spend several hours just reading these. But these are really good. I didn't want to do the spoiler section, just kind of like glossing over, here's what we learned from the 1,000 Years of Dreams.
Right.
Because they are all so different. Like, there's a lot where Kaim's a mercenary, but even within the ones where Kaim's a mercenary, he interacts with different types of people. There's different types of takeaways about it. So these are great, and like big credit to Shigematsu and Jay Rubin for, I mean, these are kind of like the soul of this game. And it's really interesting.
I totally agree. I think, honestly, this might have been my introduction to visual novels, because that's kind of what they are. And yeah, I agree. I think they're the heart and soul of this game, and none of my takeaways that are, about how beautiful this game can be would be there without those stories in this game.
Yeah. It is interesting, like trying to think, like, so if they didn't do this,
mm-hmm.
how they would have like gotten these themes across in the main game. Like it would have been tough.
It would have had to, yeah.
It would have had to change how the main game works.
Yeah, it would have had to have been a completely different game. Because yeah, the closest we get is the Liram, Cook, and Mac stuff, and that stuff is so much more tied to Kaim as a character than these anecdotes of him making these brief connections. Oh, the Shoemaker one too. I loved the Shoemaker one. But yeah, no, I cannot even, it's such a weird thing because they are so separate from the main game, but I could not imagine this game without them. I don't, it would have been a totally different beast.
Very interesting, like, decision. So if you think about how they designed this game from the ground up, like when the decision was made that we want this to be how we teach people about our character and, really dive into the themes that we want to talk about. And it's almost like they said, okay, well, the 1,000 Years of Dreams are going to deal in all of these things. And like, I think, as you mentioned earlier, we're going to show you the value of connection, mm-hmm. human connection in here, in these 1,000 Years of Dreams. And then the main plot's going to focus on the politics of it. And I think it would have been tough to like merge those together if it wasn't broken out like this.
It makes me wish that we had more than just 2 for Seth and 1 for Ming.
Yeah.
It's like
Seth's is really fucked up too. Like I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's so sad what happens to her. But like it does such a good job of making Kaim so 3-dimensional, especially when at first he's so like old Squall. But if I were able to give this game like a redo, I would get more dreams from the other Immortals. I know that Kaim's are like our main character, but the little bits that we got from Seth and Ming were great. And also, like, we could maybe not get any for Sarah because she never fully regains her memories on screen. The way that she remembers it, that she kept 1,000 years of journals. I would have loved to have read a couple of those journals as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is interesting that, we have all the other characters with, likely 1,000 years of interesting memories too, but Kaim's are the only ones that we get like a significant dive into.
Yeah.
So, all right. That's Lost Odyssey.
Yeah. Listen, I could, if I really wanted to, talk for another 2 hours with you about this, but this is a good place to end it.
Yeah. There is a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in the notes that I did not, bring up here in the spoiler section, but the things that I really, really wanted to talk about, we did get into those. And I appreciate the conversation as always.
Yeah, it was really great to talk to you today.
Yeah. Maybe Lost Odyssey would be a good candidate for Lightning Strikes Thrice at some point where that level of detail can really breathe.
Uh-huh. It's gonna be a while. Our next big project, since we've done 2 trilogies already, is after the next couple of seasons, we are going to do the Xenoblade trilogy, and that is going to take us a long time.
Yes, it is. Those are much longer games than Xenosaga games.
Yeah. Although you can just like yada 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 a lot of them, thankfully, but yeah, they're big guys.
Yeah, well, I'll be looking forward to those. I'm always like half considering replaying Xenoblade Chronicles because it's been so long, so maybe that'll be the kick in the pants to play along with you all when you get there. But yeah, again, much appreciated taking 3 hours to talk about Lost Odyssey with me, and appreciated that you were willing to replay this game for the podcast because it's not a small time commitment. So I appreciate you, and thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for for asking me on here. I love talking about games with you, and it was good motivation for me to pick it back up instead of just letting it live in my memory, even though it ended up being difficult because it was a hard game to play with my broken rib, and so I could only play a little bit at a time. But so thanks also for being accommodating as all that happened.
Of course, anytime. And if you'll come back, we'll be looking forward to the next time, the next game, to have you back on here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening as well. If you made it all the way to the end of the podcast, you are, as always, my hero. And don't forget to check down in the show notes for links to Pitch Drop, including Lightning Strikes Thrice, and everything that they have going on over there. And as always, tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.
Hello, my name is Andrew.
I'm Dylan.
And I'm Aubrey.
And we are your friendly neighborhood gamers. Our podcast aims to cover the world of video games from the perspective of the average gamer. Whether you casually play games on your phone, have a high KD in Call of Duty, or you're somewhere in between, we believe that makes you a gamer, and our show is for you.
Since our podcast started in 2022, we have done deep dive episodes on over 40 games, including The Witcher 3, Diablo 4, Marvel Snap, Cult of the Lamb, and more.
We've also discussed a wide variety of topics such as video game music, toxicity in gaming, cozy games, games based on Star Wars, and video game genre definitions.
Additionally, it's our goal to use our show to shine a light on other awesome creators by inviting them onto our podcast for interviews. We've had the pleasure of talking to podcasters, streamers, cosplayers, musicians, authors, and Donkey Kong record holders.
If any of that sounds interesting to you, we would love for you to check out our show. You can find us on all of the podcast platforms, YouTube, and on our website, fngamers.com.
Video games are a unique medium.
They can tell stories,
Immerse us in strange, fantastic worlds.
blur the very boundaries of our reality.
But at the end of the day, video games are fun. Whatever fun is to you.
I'm Jeff Moonen,
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
and on Fun and Games, we talk about the history, trends, and community of video games.
It's a celebration of all the games we play and all the fun we find within them.
And there's so many more games out there, so we hope you'll share in that conversation with us.
Fun and Games podcast with Matt and Jeff. Find us on certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And happy gaming.